The day I finished my last chemotherapy session, I drove myself home alone just like I had done 34 times before. My son never came, never called, never asked which room I sat in while the medicine dripped into my veins. That evening, he finally texted me, "Dad, some paperwork may arrive, just sign where they mark it, routine stuff." I stared at the message in my empty kitchen because my attorney had already found something recorded at the county office, and whatever my son called routine was about to destroy the lie he had built. That Tuesday I finished my last bag of chemo. Rain was coming down across the parking lot, and I made the drive to the hospital myself the same way I'd made it for all 34 sessions before, alone and early, with a thermos of coffee that had gone lukewarm by the time I found a parking spot on level 3. At 60 years old, I was a retired construction engineer who'd spent 40 years putting up structures meant to outlast the hands that raised them. I knew load-bearing walls and foundation specs and how concrete cures differently depending on temperature and humidity. What I was still working to understand was how a human body keeps functioning when the people you built your whole life around have quietly slipped out the door. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge. Glad you're here with me today. If these stories of ordinary people standing up for what's right mean something to you, I'd be grateful if you subscribed and hit the like button. It helps more people find their way to this channel. Before we get going, drop a comment and tell me based on what you know so far. Do you think a father in this situation would fight back through the courts or find another way entirely? I'd love to hear where you think this is headed. One note before we begin: some details in this story have been shaped for the purpose of audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is coincidental. It's the truth at the center of it that matters. Cleveland Clinic Taussig Cancer Center occupies the boundary of Cleveland's University Circle neighborhood, all glass and steel, the kind of building that reads as a corporate campus until you notice the IV poles visible through the lobby windows. 35 times I'd pushed through those automatic doors, nodded back at the woman behind reception who'd long since stopped asking my name, ridden the elevator to 3, walked the hallway with its posters about inner strength, and stepped through the double doors into the infusion ward. The nurse assigned to my chair had been there every Tuesday for 9 months. Her movements around the IV pole were economical and sure. Mine were beginning to betray me, a fine tremor in both hands that was chemistry, not nerves. Around 45, I'd guess, with reading glasses tucked into her breast pocket, and a professional warmth she'd clearly earned the hard way, working daily in a ward where every patient was being poisoned back toward health. "Last one, Mr. Pruitt," she said, threading the line. "How does that feel?" Like the end of a project that ran over schedule. That got a real smile out of her. "Well, you did the work. That's what matters." I settled into recliner number 4, same one I'd requested every time because it faced the window and gave me something to look at besides the other patients. Half a circle of 12 chairs, each station its own small universe of IV pole and medical cart. I inventoried them the way I always did because counting is what engineers do. We measure. We quantify. 11 other patients occupying the room alongside me that morning. I cataloged their companions next. The woman in chair 3, her husband beside her working a crossword out loud, asking her for 6-letter words meaning temporary. Chair 9, a grown son reading his father the sports page, their voices low and unhurried. Chair 1, a young woman couldn't have been past 30, sharing earbuds with her partner, both of them watching something on a phone that managed to make them smile. 12 chairs, 11 fellow patients, 19 total bodies in that room, which worked out to 18 companions, and then there was me. Across town somewhere, my 4-year-old granddaughter Nora was probably seated at her mother's breakfast table, completely unaware that her grandfather was in a hospital recliner running attendance counts. She came on weekends when Colton's calendar opened up, which it had been slow to do lately. She was the one variable in all of this. I had decided in advance to hold off the ledger entirely. I won't try to describe what it's like to sit in a room engineered for hope with a dark phone screen for the 35th session in a row. It isn't dramatic. No single revelation lands cleanly. It's closer to watching a foundation shift by degrees, hairline fractures that accumulate so quietly you don't register the change until you stand back and the lean in the whole structure is obvious. I unfolded a piece of paper from my coat pocket while the drip worked its way through the port they'd placed surgically in my chest the previous January. The paper had gone soft at the folds, creased along the exact same lines from 11 months of handling. 3 names in my own block lettering: Colton son, Audra sister, Vernon friend of 30 years. A single pencil line through each. No rage in those marks, just deliberate level strokes recording the sessions when I stopped waiting. Colton's line came after session 12, the Tuesday I accepted. He'd gone silent on purpose. Audra's came after session 18. I'd said on the phone that Tuesdays were wearing on me. She'd replied, "That's nice, Russell," in the flat tone of someone already thinking about something else. Vernon's I drew after session 23 the day I crossed him in the grocery store and he took one look at my thinning hair and told me he'd been meaning to reach out. I said, "Sure, Vern," and steered my cart around him. I already knew the call would never come. I pulled up my phone. Nothing. No missed calls, no new messages. Colton's previous text sat 4 months back in the thread. "Dad, I need to borrow $3K, car repair emergency." I'd moved the money the same hour. No questions asked. No acknowledgement received. I'd followed up with 3 separate texts asking how he was holding up. The read receipts confirmed he'd opened all of them. 90 minutes the infusion. Same as every prior session. I observed the bag the way I once tracked a concrete pour, watching the rate scanning for air in the line, confirming the flow stayed within spec. She checked my pressure and oxygen twice, logged both readings on her tablet, adjusted the drip once after I said I felt a chill. When the bag ran empty, she pulled the line cleanly. No wasted motion. The shaking in my hands had worsened, not an emotional response, just the body's accumulated reaction to 35 rounds of chemicals calibrated to destroy fast-dividing cells while leaving enough of me functional to walk out. "Is someone coming for you today, Mr. Pruitt?" Her eyes were on my hands. The tremorings heavier than last week. 11 months in that ward had given me one reliable skill: lying while holding eye contact. "My friend's downstairs waiting," I said steady. "Good." She entered something on the tablet. "You shouldn't be behind the wheel right after a session. Look after yourself." "I will," I said, the second lie of the exchange. I took the stairs to my truck on level 3, one hand on the rail, because standing still in an elevator wasn't something I could manage just then. Outside, the rain had quit, but the pavement was wet and colorless. I sat parked for 5 full minutes before I turned the key, giving the tremor time to subside to something I could work around. I told her someone was meeting me downstairs. That was a lie. I pointed the truck home the same way I'd navigated every one of those 11 months alone, with hands that weren't entirely steady. What I'd kept from her, what I hadn't disclosed to a single person, was that the one I'd organized my whole existence around had never once thought to ask which building I disappeared into every Tuesday. In fewer than 16 hours, I'd find out precisely where his attention had been going instead. I reached the house around 4 in the afternoon and stood in the kitchen long enough to remind myself that eating was something I was supposed to do. I'd designed the place myself and broken ground on it 20 years ago, half an acre outside Cleveland, brick veneer over wood frame roof pitch, engineered to carry snow loads 20% beyond what code demanded. Every corner true. Every door hung plumb. Every window locked tight against the cold, because I'd set each frame myself, leveled it 3 separate times before driving a single fastener. I put soup on the stove and dropped bread in the toaster, moving through the kitchen on autopilot, the choreography of a man who'd run the same routine 10,000 times. The counter where I eventually set the bowl was granite I'd selected from a quarry in Minnesota. The cabinet boxes I'd constructed from oak-fitted joints throughout no composite material anywhere. The floor underfoot was original hardwood, refinished twice across 2 decades and still without flex. While the soup came up to temperature, I slid open the deep drawer under the breakfast bar where the house documents lived. The original blueprints were coiled inside a cardboard tube paper yellowed with age, but every line still crisp. I unrolled them on the counter, anchoring the corners with my coffee mug and the sugar bowl. Lower right title block: owner Russell J. Pruitt, architect Russell J. Pruitt, contractor independent, self-built. Date March 2002. The corner room upstairs, front-facing, I'd built that one with intention. When Colton hit 10, I had gone back in and added extra blocking between the studs so he could put shelves wherever he felt like it, no stud finder required. Framed a window seat with storage built into the base. Pulled 2 dedicated circuits so he'd never have to choose between his computer and his stereo. The room had been sitting vacant for 3 years, ever since he loaded out his belongings following his wedding. Bare walls, a window seat collecting dust. I finished the soup standing at the counter, eyes on the blueprints, the way I used to go over drawings the night before an inspection, methodical, looking for anything that didn't hold up to scrutiny. Everything checked out. Everything always checked out. At 6:30, my phone moved on the counter. Colton, 28 years old, pulling inconsistent commissions as a real estate agent, had sent his first message in 4 months. The register was offhand, breezy. It triggered something in the region of my brain that spent 4 decades reading the early signs of structural failure. "Hey Dad, you doing okay? BTW, some paperwork might come your way. Just sign where they mark it. It's routine stuff for the property tax filing." 4 reads. Then I placed the phone face down and brought my eyes back to the blueprints. Owner Russell J. Pruitt, routine paperwork, property tax filing. For 20 years, I had handled those taxes without assistance. The county mailed a bill every March. I settled it online or cut a check. Beyond the original closing documents, now 2 decades old, There was no paperwork attached to this property that required my signature. I'd built a career on erecting structures designed to outlast the people who commissioned them. Hospitals, schools, municipal buildings, private residences for families who wanted something that would stand for generations. I'd learned over 4 decades that the structures most likely to fail weren't the ones with visible damage. They were the ones where somebody had quietly pulled a load-bearing element and painted over the void. By the time the ceiling showed it, the collapse was already written. I left Colton's text unanswered. I rolled the blueprints back into their tube and slid the drawer shut. Then I sat at the kitchen table and watched the light drain from gray to black outside the window, turning the word routine over in my mind. Garland Hecht called at 7:30 Wednesday morning, and after 30 years I knew his early calls meant something that needed saying before the day swallowed it. Garland was 58, a retired attorney whose practice had covered real estate and corporate finance, my oldest friend and the one person who read deeds and contracts the way I read structural drawings. "Russell," he said, and there were tiny hesitations between his words that told me he'd been up for a while working out how to begin. "Morning, Garland." "I ran a routine title check yesterday," he said, then paused. "Your name showed up on a recently recorded land transaction at the Cuyahoga County Recorder of Deeds." I was standing at the kitchen counter with weak November light coming through the window over the sink. I set my coffee mug down with care. "What kind of transaction?" "That's what I need to ask you." Another pause. "Did you authorize any transfer of your property recently?" No 4 seconds of silence. I tracked them the way I used to count the gap between lightning and thunder when I was gauging storm distance. "Russell, I need you to think carefully. Anything you signed in the last year, anything Colton might have brought to you, or Amber, any attorneys, anything at all." "No, nothing. No powers of attorney. No quitclaim deeds. Nothing about property tax filings." The last part hit me like a framing hammer coming down flat. "Colton sent me a text last night," I said. "Told me paperwork might show up and to sign wherever they marked it. Called it routine property tax business." I'd known Garland Hecht for 30 years. He had never once asked me to bring hospital records to a meeting. "Don't sign a thing," Garland said, and his voice shifted from measured to something harder. "Russell, I mean it. Nothing. Not before we sit down. What did you find?" "I think you should come in today if you're able." He drew a breath. "Bring your medical records from last February. Hospital documentation, surgical logs, anything that puts you somewhere specific and establishes your condition at the time." "February," I said. He said specifically mid-February, the week of Valentine's Day. I'd had surgery on February 14th, pancreatic tumor biopsy, general anesthesia, overnight observation. Colton had promised to come by after I came around from the procedure. He never showed. "I can be there by 10:10, I said. "I'll have coffee ready," Garland said, and ended the call. I finished what was left in my mug at the counter, then went upstairs to the filing cabinet. The February medical records sat in a manila folder marked Cleveland Clinic Main Campus General Surgery 2022. I took the whole folder. Garland had asked for medical records from that February, not financial statements, not the deed. Medical records. He'd turned up something in the county recorder system that required him to know precisely where I had been and what state I'd been in on a specific date 7 months back. I'd put up 37 structures across my career. The ones that gave way were rarely the ones showing obvious wear. Garland's home office carried the smell of old paper and a particular kind of stillness that only develops in rooms where serious matters have been worked through over a very long time. 3 documents were laid out on his desk when I walked in at 2:00 Wednesday afternoon. He didn't offer coffee. That told me most of what I needed to know before he said a word. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined every wall, legal volumes, Ohio statutes, case law, organized decade by decade. The desk was walnut old enough to have genuine character, and Garland had set those 3 documents in a precise row the way a structural engineer lines up failure analysis reports before a debrief. My medical folder felt light in my hands all of a sudden. "Sit down, Russell," Garland said. I sat. He touched the first document with one finger and slid it across the polished wood toward me. "Quitclaim deed," he said. "Recorded at the Cuyahoga County Recorder of Deeds, February 15, 2022. Grantor Russell J. Pruitt, executed by Colton Pruitt acting as your power of attorney agent. Grantee Nadine Kellner. Consideration $1. I looked at the document. Official county stamp. Recording number. Legal description of the property. My property, the house I had drawn the plans for and built with my own hands. Every corner true, every joint sound, transferred away for $1. "Who is Nadine Kellner?" I asked. "Amber's mother," Garland said quietly. "Your daughter-in-law's mother. 58 years old, lives in Akron, retired school administrator. I ran the background this morning. Nadine Kellner, a woman I had never laid eyes on, whose name now sat on the deed to my home as the recipient of a $1 transaction, was my daughter-in-law's mother. Somehow my son had concluded that robbing his dying father was acceptable family conduct. $520,000 in equity, I said, reading the assessed value notation. Signed away for $1. By someone claiming authority under a power of attorney, Garland corrected. He slid the second document forward. Which brings us to this. The power of attorney was printed on legal paper, properly formatted, complete with notary seal and signature block. It granted Colton Pruitt full financial and real estate authority over my assets. Effective date February 14, 2022. The principal's signature was a version of my name that passed a quick glance but didn't hold up to scrutiny. I studied it the way I used to examine questionable welds on a job site, looking for the precise flaw that would cause failure once load was applied. The G in Pruitt, I said. Too rounded. I cut that letter with a sharper angle. I noticed that as well, Garland said. That is not your signature. No, Garland said. It's not. I had sat with Colton at the kitchen table when he was 6 years old, lined paper in front of him, and walked him through how to form his letters. Showed him the capital C, showed him the loop in the P for Pruitt. He'd practiced it dozens of times, tongue pressed between his teeth, trying to do it right, wanting to get it exactly the way I showed him. I found myself wondering if he'd gone through the same process with my signature, how many times he'd run it on scratch paper before he felt confident enough to put it on a legal document. The notary, I said, pointing to the seal. Amber Kellner Pruitt, Garland said. Your daughter-in-law. Licensed notary public, her seal, her signature, her notary number, all current and valid as of February 2022. She had notarized the document her husband forged. That's what it appears to be. Conspiracy among other charges, Garland said. But there's a fundamental problem with the entire construction. He reached for my medical folder, opened it, and laid the Cleveland Clinic main campus records I'd brought beside the power of attorney, lining up the dates. February 14, 2022, he read. Cleveland Clinic main campus. Patient Russell J. Pruitt admitted for thoracic surgery at 6:47 a.m. Preoperative preparation completed at 8:30. General anesthesia administered at 9:15 a.m. Procedure duration 4 hours 20 minutes. Patient remained under anesthesia and post-surgical observation until 7:30 p.m. He looked up at me. You were on a surgical table. I was. And while you were under, he said, your son was signing your name to instruments he had no legal standing to execute. Garland set his finger on the power of attorney. Ohio law is unambiguous on this point, Russell. The principal must possess legal capacity at the moment of signing. You were under general anesthesia. No capacity, no awareness, no ability to consent. So the power of attorney is void on its face, which means everything executed under that fraudulent authority is likewise void. The deed transfer, any financial transactions, all of it. I should have felt something loosen in my chest. Instead, I felt cold moving through me the same way anesthesia had moved that morning 9 months ago, the slow, creeping numbness before the lights went out. There's one more thing, Garland said. He drew a single sheet from a folder I hadn't registered, sitting to one side. I pulled Colton's credit card records. The emergency card you added him to 3 years ago. He slid the page across the desk. Credit card transaction log. February 14, 2022. 7:45 p.m. Kimpton Schofield Hotel, Cleveland. Charge $340. I looked at it without speaking. He took me there for my 55th birthday, I said. My voice came out sounding like someone else's. I know, Garland said quietly. Valentine's Day. While I was intubated and unconscious 3 miles away at Cleveland Clinic main campus, my son and my daughter-in-law had been celebrating at the Kimpton Schofield. They charged it to my emergency card, I said. They did, Garland said, while you were in recovery. I looked at the 3 documents arranged in their precise row. The deed showing my house transferred away for $1. The power of attorney with its forged signature and my daughter-in-law's notary seal. The hospital records establishing I was unconscious at the precise moment I supposedly granted that authority. And beside them, the credit card receipt from a romantic Valentine's dinner billed to my account while I lay alone in a recovery room. 3 documents, 1 date, February 14th. Garland, I said, my voice measured and level. What do we do with this? He leaned back, hands folded across his chest. That depends, he said, on how far you want to take it. The deed was void, he'd said that. But void wasn't the same as reversed, and reversed wasn't the same as recovered, and recovered wasn't the same as what it would cost my son to get there. I drove home from Garland's through the dark and sat in my living room without switching on the overhead light, working through what any structure needs before you can dismantle it responsibly. The photocopied documents were spread across the coffee table. Even by the thin light from the street lamp outside, I could make out the signatures, the dates, the recording numbers. Everything assembled with mechanical precision. My son had engineered this theft the way I'd always taught him to approach a project: establish the objective, gather the tools, execute while conditions were favorable. Valentine's Day. While I was under. I could drive to his apartment tomorrow morning, lay the documents on his kitchen table, and watch him reach for excuses. That image carried a certain immediate pull. But immediate satisfaction is how amateur demolition crews operate: swing the wrecking ball at the face of the building and hope everything comes down in the right direction. I'd spent 40 years doing it the other way. If I moved on Colton now, he would panic. Panic would send him straight to Nadine. Nadine would shift assets, move money, throw up new legal barriers. Amber would clear her inbox, wipe records, erase whatever digital trail she could reach. They'd had 7 months to construct this fraud. Given warning, they could dismantle the evidence in 7 hours. Every bridge I'd ever put up began with a geotechnical survey before a single form was set. Core samples, bedrock depth, water table readings. You had to understand the ground before you built on it. The same logic worked in reverse. Across 40 years of construction, I had never taken down a structure without first charting every load-bearing point. You don't bring a building down by hitting the top. You find the critical supports, then remove them in the right sequence. At 800, I called Garland. "We don't move until we have everything," I said. 3 seconds of quiet. "I was hoping you'd say that. How long will it take?" "Depends what everything means," Garland said. "If you want the complete picture, bank records, county recorder files, the notary public who certified that POA, any other instruments they may have executed under that fraudulent authority, I'd estimate 2 weeks minimum. Could run to 3. "Do it," I said. "Every document, every transaction, every signature. I want to know exactly what they did and exactly when." "Russell," Garland said carefully, "this is going to cost something. Investigation fees, legal time." "I don't care what it costs." A pause. "All right, I'll start pulling records in the morning." After we hung up, I took the house blueprints from the kitchen drawer and unrolled them across the dining table. In the margin of the title page, I wrote Colton's name at the top. Below it, Nadine. Below that, Amber. Then I drew a clean, straight line beneath all 3 names with my mechanical pencil, the same one I'd carried for 35 years, the same one I'd used to draft those blueprints in 2002. I'd built this house with my hands. I was going to build the case to recover it the same way, one precise measurement at a time. That Thursday, I finally walked into the Cleveland Clinic Taussig Cancer Center support group. It was less about wanting to be there and more about running out of arguments against it. My oncologist had been raising it for 3 months. I'd been declining for 3 months. But 10 days into Garland's investigation, sitting alone in the house each evening with nothing but photocopied fraud documents and an expanding catalog of legal violations, I'd come to understand that isolation wasn't a strategy, it was just isolation. The group met on the 2nd floor in a community room with 12 plastic chairs set in a circle, pale winter light falling through windows that looked out toward the Allegheny River. 7 people were already seated when I arrived at 200. An 8th, a woman in her 50s wearing a volunteer badge, gestured toward an open chair. I sat. For the next hour, I listened to people talk about their treatments, their fears, the small things that had started to feel like victories again. A man in his 40s described the first time in 6 months food had tasted like something other than metal. A woman in her 60s talked about her grandson's upcoming birthday party, about the promise she'd made herself to be there and how she was going to keep it. When the circle reached me, I said nothing, just a slight shake of my head. The facilitator didn't push, just moved on. The only person in the room who didn't look at me with concern or carefully managed sympathy was the woman seated directly across from me. Cecile Dunford, 57 years old, a retired internal medicine physician with sharp, attentive eyes and the deliberate speech of someone who'd spent decades giving patients difficult information, sat with her hands folded in her lap and was the only one present who didn't make a project out of getting me to open up. Instead, I studied the room's construction. 4 steel columns at 12 feet on center lateral beams distributing the floor load above. Double-paned windows, thermally broken aluminum frames. Sound engineering, built to last. When the session ended at 3:00 and people began gathering their coats, I stayed in my chair, still mapping the column spacing and working out the approximate load distribution in my head. "You're an engineer," the woman across from me said. Not a question, a statement. I met her eyes directly for the first time. "How could you tell?" "You spent the full hour examining the load-bearing columns instead of the people," Cecile said. "A physician does the same thing. We look at the structure before we look at the symptoms." I rose and pulled on my coat. "Professional hazard or professional training," she said. "There's a distinction." "Did the structure pass inspection?" I asked. She paused, giving the question the same careful consideration she'd applied to sizing me up. Tilted her head slightly, eyes moving to the nearest column, then back. "Jury's still out," she said. The phrase settled in the air between us, precise, measured, empty of easy reassurance. Then she turned and walked out her steps steady on the tile floor. I stayed standing in the emptied room looking at the columns she'd appraised, wondering why her verdict carried any weight with me at all. I'd met plenty of people in the past year who looked at me and registered a sick man. Cecile Dunford looked and saw a structure with load-bearing columns worth assessing. I wasn't sure yet whether that was an improvement, but it was different. And different after 11 months of the same unbroken quiet felt like something worth noting. Colton called on a Friday morning while I was in the garage working through my tool cabinet, something I've always done when I needed to think without appearing to think. The call came in at 9:17, which meant he'd had his coffee and built up to it. I'd been turning Cecile Dunford's assessment over in my mind. Jury's still out. Professional language that made no claims it couldn't support. "Hey, Dad," Colton said. "How you feeling?" "Good as expected." I was holding a framing hammer I'd owned for 32 years, handle-worn, glassy smooth from use. "That's great. So about that paperwork I mentioned, the property stuff. Has anything come through yet?" "Haven't seen anything," I said, which was accurate in the sense that documents already recorded at the county 7 months ago don't show up in mailboxes. "Huh. Well, it should be along soon." A pause. "Actually, that's kind of why I'm calling. Amber and I were thinking, with your treatment winding down and the house being as large as it is, maybe it makes sense for us to handle the property management side of things, just to take the pressure off while you're getting your strength back." I set the hammer down on the workbench. "Handle the house, son. Oh, you know, bills, maintenance, that kind of thing. You wouldn't need to think about any of it." I let the silence open up. Colton filled it. "We'd make sure everything stayed in good shape. Keep the lawn up, deal with repairs, manage the utilities. You could just concentrate on recovering." "That's thoughtful of you," I said. A longer silence. I could sense him trying to read the response, fishing for commitment where I'd offered only acknowledgement. "So, should we go ahead and set that up?" "I'll think about it." "Oh, okay, yeah, sure, just let me know." We said our goodbyes. I picked up the hammer again. My son had a talent I'd never fully understood until that morning, the ability to ask for something he'd already taken. The house he wanted to manage had been deeded to his mother-in-law 7 months ago while I was under anesthesia. The bills he wanted to handle were drawing down a savings account he'd been systematically emptying. I told him I'd think about it. That was true. I'd been thinking about very little else for 2.5 weeks. Garland arrived at my kitchen table Saturday at noon with 2 takeout coffees and an accordion file fat enough to prop open a door. He set it on the white oak table I'd built and opened it without any preamble. 3 weeks. Here's what I found." He began pulling documents, organizing them into labeled stacks, each clipped and tagged. "Your savings account." He slid the first stack across to me. $47,000 systematically drained over 8 months through micro-withdrawals, all kept strictly under $10,000 to stay beneath bank currency reporting thresholds. That's structuring, a separate federal offense. I worked through the withdrawal records. $9,700, $9,200, $8,850, a pattern built to stay below the radar. How much did he think he could extract before I'd notice all of it, apparently? Garland pulled the next stack. "Your retirement fund." Colton added himself as joint account holder using the fraudulent power of attorney. He hasn't touched it yet, probably because early withdrawals generate tax penalties and IRS attention, but he's had full access since March. 1 month after the surgery. He was methodical, Garland said. The savings account was the easy entry point. The retirement fund was queued for later. The house was the load-bearing piece of the whole structure. Transfer the asset to Nadine Kellner, establish leverage maneuver ownership from there. I drank my coffee. It had gone cold. "Russell, there's something I should have told you earlier." I looked at him. 20 years ago, I did legal work for the Kellner family. Nadine's divorce settlement. I represented her ex-husband. The proceedings were contentious, assets complicated. I understand their financial structure, how Nadine operates, what her security is built on. He paused. And I know where the bodies are buried. 30 years of friendship, and Garland Hecht had never once raised the Kellner name. I let that sit for a moment. He sat with it too, not rushing to fill the quiet, the kind of thing only people who've known each other a long time can do without it turning into a problem. "Why are you telling me now?" "Because now you need it." Garland reached into the folder and drew out one more document, this one in a clear plastic sleeve. Nadine established a trust structure during the divorce to shield marital assets set up under her sister's name, dormant for years but never dissolved. It's still active. And if I'm reading the pattern correctly, if Colton and Nadine are coordinating, that trust is likely where the money they're pulling from you is going. He slid the document across the oak. Trust agreement established 2003. Trustee Nadine Kellner. Beneficiary Laureen Kellner, sister deceased 2018. Current status active. No distributions since 2018. She's been operating this trust for 4 years after her sister died. Garland said, collecting assets, paying no taxes, making no distributions to the rightful heirs. That's trust fraud. And if Colton is routing stolen funds into that structure, it becomes a RICO predicate. I looked at the document, then at Garland. You've been sitting on this for 20 years. I've been bound by attorney-client privilege for 20 years, Garland said. But Nadine was never my client, her ex-husband was. Now that I have evidence she's using that trust structure to facilitate ongoing fraud against you, privilege dissolves under the crime fraud exception. The law on that is unambiguous. I thought about the strategic patience of the past few weeks, the methodical evidence gathering, the discipline required to listen to my son pitch property management over the phone while documents on my counter proved he'd stolen the property months earlier. That's the most honest thing either of us has done in a long time, I said. Garland smiled slightly. I thought you'd see it that way. What else do we need? 2 more weeks, maybe 3. I want to track every dollar, every transaction, every signature. When we move, I want them to have no room left to run. He'd carried that information for 2 decades and waited for the right moment. That's not concealment, that's patience with purpose. The call came at 7:12 on a Monday morning from a number I didn't recognize. In my experience, unknown numbers at 7:00 in the morning are never good news. Garland had left Saturday afternoon with his promise to keep tracing the money. 2 more weeks, maybe 3. I'd spent Sunday organizing the shop, cleaning tools that didn't need it, turning over trust structures and crime fraud exceptions, and the particular look in Garland's eyes when he'd said he knew where the bodies were buried. Then Monday arrived with an unknown number. Mr. Pruitt. The voice was female, professional, with the practiced calm of someone who delivered difficult news regularly enough to know that steadiness was the only useful thing she could offer. This is Nurse Weston at Cleveland Clinic, main campus ICU. Your son Colton was in a serious accident on Interstate 480. He's stable, but we need you to come in. I was sitting on the edge of the bed. I stood. How bad? Fractured right femur, spinal contusions. He's in the trauma bay, conscious and asking for family. Nurse Weston had the even voice of someone who understood that certain information lands harder when it's delivered without emotional cushioning. She gave me the address. I already knew it and the trauma unit number as well. I was in my truck by 7:30. The drive to Cleveland Clinic main campus took 18 minutes in morning traffic. The same hospital where I'd had surgery in February. The same building where Colton had signed away my house while I was unconscious 3 floors below. I left the truck into the visitor garage and followed the signs to the surgical trauma wing. The waiting area had vinyl chairs arranged in rows of 4, a wall-mounted television running morning news on mute, and a reception desk where I gave my name and was told to wait. They'd call me when Colton was clear of the trauma bay. I sat. The clock on the wall read 7:52. By 8:30, I'd checked my phone. Nothing from Amber, nothing from Nadine, nothing from Colton, obviously, but no word from anyone in his immediate orbit either. By 9:15, I was still sitting alone. I watched the other families. A woman pacing near the windows with her phone pressed against her ear, talking in low, urgent bursts. A teenage boy sleeping against his mother's shoulder in the row across from mine. An older couple holding hands side by side, both of them fixed on the surgical wing doors with the steady patience of people who'd done this kind of waiting before. Everyone present for someone they loved. Nobody in that room sitting by themselves. I counted 12 families in the waiting area. 11 had at least 2 people. I was the only one there alone. I'd sat through 35 chemotherapy sessions in this hospital system without a visitor. Now I was in a different waiting room in the same building, waiting for news about the son who'd stolen my house while I lay unconscious 3 floors below. The irony wasn't lost on me. Neither was the instinct that had put me in the car at 7:30 without a second's hesitation. Love doesn't stop being love just because it's been betrayed. I was learning that at a cost. At 9:45, a surgical resident came through the double doors and called a name that wasn't mine. A couple got up and followed him back through. The room got quieter. I checked my phone again. Nothing. At 10:15, Amber Kellner Pruitt walked into the trauma waiting area. 26 years old, married to my son for 3 years. I'd seen her maybe a dozen times across that span holidays. Colton's birthday, one strained dinner after my diagnosis where she'd spent most of the meal on her phone. She came through the door carrying a Dunkin' large caramel latte, her winter coat spotless. Her hair professionally styled in a way that meant she'd taken time that morning to get ready for something other than a hospital waiting room. Her name was written on the cup in neat script. She hadn't come from the direction of the trauma bays. She came from the parking garage entrance, which told me she'd just arrived 3 hours after the accident. She swept the waiting room, found me, and walked over. Not quickly, not with any of the urgency that belongs to someone whose husband is in a trauma bay. She moved the way a person moves through a professional function, deliberate, measuring her approach. "Mr. Pruitt," she said when she reached my row, "I'm so glad you're here. We really need you right now. Not how is Colton, not have you heard anything, not I'm sorry I'm late. We really need you right now." I stood up, matching her posture. "You just got here," I said. She blinked once. I had to take care of a few things first. Insurance, medical leave from his job, that sort of thing. Colton had sent her a text from the ambulance letting her know I'd been reached. He texted you while he was in the ambulance, yes. She lifted her latte and drank. Has anyone come out with news, Num? I've been here since 7:40. Oh. She tilted her phone up to check the time. They'll probably want the two of us together when they start talking next steps, treatment decisions, all that. She lowered herself into the seat next to mine, crossed one leg over the other, rested her coffee on the side table. The phone reappeared and she began scrolling. I didn't sit back down. I'd spent 40 years watching that exact expression form across boardroom tables. The one that surfaces once somebody spots how you fit into their plans, once they locate the structural member they need and begin running the numbers on what it will bear. Amber Kellner Pruitt wasn't regarding me the way a daughter-in-law regards a father-in-law when the family is in crisis. Her gaze had the quality of a general contractor who's just identified a load-bearing wall and is already mentally repositioning it. Nothing about her read like a woman whose husband was flat on his back in a trauma bay with a shattered femur. She had the composure of someone who'd grabbed coffee on the way to a routine business meeting, arrived 3 hours behind, and was now tallying up what the room had to offer. My son lay in a hospital bed with a broken leg while his wife sat a cushion away from me, phone in hand, $12 drink in the other, quietly running a calculation. What I was turning over in my mind was whether she had any idea I could see it. Nadine Kellner stepped through the door of the admissions office at precisely 11:00, which meant she'd been somewhere in that building for a while, biding her time, and she was put together like someone headed to a lunch meeting rather than a medical emergency. Amber had been on her phone for 20 minutes out in the waiting room. I'd initially framed it as a question, what was she doing, but I already knew. She'd been tracking the clock until Nadine made her entrance. The admissions office itself was a tight space metal desk, 2 chairs, a monitor on the counter. The coordinator, a middle-aged woman named Cutler, 20 years of hospital billing written into every economical movement she made, had summoned me back to talk through financial responsibility for Colton's treatment. I'd come alone, or thought I had. Nadine materialized in the doorway behind me, her heels sharp against the linoleum, her greeting to Coordinator Cutler warm and practiced as though they went back years. Mr. Pruitt, she said, pivoting to me with studied formality. A packet of documents landed on the metal desk in front of us, placed with the deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed the gesture. Under the circumstances, we felt it was sensible for you to be identified as the financially responsible party for Colton's care. He's your son, and naturally we want him to have every resource available to him. She had walked into a hospital carrying prepared paperwork, which meant one of two things: she'd been aware of the accident before anyone dialed my number at 7:12 that morning, or she kept documents like these staged and ready for exactly this type of situation. I reviewed the forms. Boilerplate financial responsibility agreements, yellow highlighted signature lines. What's the status of Colton's health coverage through his employer, I asked. Coordinator Cutler turned to her screen. Give me a moment. Fingers on the keyboard, then a pause. The policy was terminated 3 months back, September, non-payment. Nadine's face gave away nothing. 3 months, meaning Colton had been uninsured since September. During the same period, he'd been methodically drawing down my savings and positioning himself as joint holder on my retirement account. I read through the paperwork again, then raised my eyes to Nadine. I'd want to go through this carefully, I told her. Could you allow me until tomorrow morning? The corners of Nadine's smile pulled in slightly. Naturally, these aren't decisions to be rushed. Nadine Kellner had walked through a hospital entrance carrying a pen and a contract, not a get-well card. She hadn't come to offer comfort to her son-in-law, she'd come to secure a financial backstop, and she'd accomplished it while Colton was still being stabilized down the hall. That evening I phoned Garland from home. He told me he'd be at my door by 8 the next day. He was already at the kitchen table with a legal yellow pad in front of him when Nadine rang at exactly 8:00 Tuesday morning. I set the call on speaker. Mr. Pruitt, Nadine said, her tone carrying that same frictionless authority. I'd like to talk through what Colton's care is going to look like going forward. Garland's pen found the page immediately, time, date, caller, all of it down in sequence. I'm listening, I said. Colton's rehabilitation needs are going to be extensive. The medical team is projecting 6 to 8 weeks before he regains unassisted mobility. That means physical therapy, wound management, pain protocols. It adds up to a serious commitment, I understand that. Here's the reality. Mr. Pruitt, hospital costs are steep and rehab facilities steeper still, and Colton's coverage situation isn't straightforward at the moment. It lapsed in September. A short pause, yes, so the path forward is going to require some creative thinking about care. Colton's going to need someone present around the clock during recovery, not a hired clinician. Family. Garland put a line under the word family. We'd thought perhaps you could return to the house for a period, Nadine went on. The ground floor storage room is a workable option. You'd be positioned to assist with the day-to-day. meals, housekeeping, repositioning him through the night to head off bed sores. The doctors are clear that the first month is the critical window. I glanced at Garland. His pen hadn't stopped. What would I be paid for this? I asked. A pause longer than the last one. You're his father, Mr. Pruitt. Family doesn't have a dollar figure. Garland drew 2 lines under that one, still not looking up. I see. Amber and I both carry full-time jobs, Nadine said. We don't have the capacity to deliver the kind of care Colton requires. You're retired, you have the availability. And honestly, after the way Colton showed up for you during your illness, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect some reciprocation. Every syllable was going into the record. That was what Garland's even unhurried penmanship was actually for. Nadine was assembling a cage in real time, framing it one sensible-sounding sentence at a time, and Garland was taking the measurements as she built. I need to check with my physician first, I said, about whether my body is up to that kind of demand after treatment. I'll have an answer for you before the week is out, of course, Nadine said. But the timeline is short. Colton is being discharged Friday morning. There needs to be a plan in place somewhere for him to land and someone to take over his care. The line went dead. I looked at Garland's pad. 3 pages filled margin to margin, organized into columns: financial coercion, unpaid labor, emotional manipulation. In the emotional manipulation column, he'd recorded, family doesn't have a dollar figure. 2 underlines beneath it. You don't have to walk into this, Garland said, his voice low. I took his pad and read the column headings back to myself. She's asking me to take up residence in the storage room of my own house, I said. The house she acquired from me for $1 while I was sedated and unable to object. She wants full-time skilled care around the clock, no wages. She wants me doing the cooking, the cleaning, rolling my son over every few hours through the night so he doesn't develop pressure sores. And I'm supposed to count myself fortunate for the chance because family doesn't have a dollar figure. Yes, Garland said, her read on me is that desperation has set in far enough that I'll accept it. She believes the isolation has gone on long enough and my need to be near Colton is acute enough that I'll step into a storage room and work without pay and call it love. That's her calculation. Garland didn't disagree. I pulled out a chair at my kitchen table and sat down. Then I believe I have to take this, I said. Garland studied me for a long beat. Then he opened to a blank page on the legal pad and printed across the top, residency documentation, Russell Pruitt. We'll need a photographic record, he said. The storage room as it stands before you arrive, dimensions, condition, all of it dated and with a witness. Do you expect they'll put something in front of me to sign? Nadine Kellner doesn't enter a room without documentation behind her, Garland said. Whatever she slides across to you Friday morning, I need eyes on it before you pick up a pen. Nadine Kellner had extended an invitation for me to move back into the house she'd gotten from me for $1. Garland and I let that sit in the air for a moment once the documentation plan was settled. Yes, I said, the same words landing again. I believe I have to do this. 1 bag was all I packed, not because 1 bag was sufficient, but because a man who walks in with a single bag reads as a visitor, and visitor was exactly what I needed to look like entering the house I'd constructed with my own hands. Garland put in Thursday afternoon working through the storage room with a camera, every angle covered, every measurement recorded, the missing heat ducts noted in writing. By the time I swung into the driveway at 10:00 Friday morning, canvas duffel over my shoulder, duplicates of everything Garland had cataloged were secured in a safe deposit box at KeyBank downtown. Amber answered the door. The storage room is back this way, she said, no greeting, already moving down the hall toward the ground floor. It makes the most sense practically. She pushed the door open and moved aside. I was standing on concrete I had mixed and poured with my own hands in March 2002. Walls I had framed out from 2x6 studs set at 16-inch centers. A window I had hung myself with a sill that required the same half-turn to the left before it would budge, a small defect I'd never gotten around to correcting because I was the only one who'd ever needed to know. The room had no heat, no furnishings beyond a folding cot that had been pulled in from the garage. Some things don't transfer with a deed, even a legitimate one. This works, I said. Nadine appeared in the kitchen 20 minutes later while I was positioning my bag next to the cot. She had documents with her. We should formalize this, she said, pushing a paper across the kitchen counter. Standard residency agreement, occupancy terms, maintenance expectations, that kind of thing. I read through it deliberately. 2 pages plain language about temporary housing in exchange for caregiving. Nothing complex, nothing that would survive a challenge from anyone who knew contract law. My attorney reviewed your terms and put together a more complete version, I said, drawing Garland's document from my jacket pocket. Covers every contingency. Standard practice. Nadine took it and scanned the opening page. Garland had drafted 8 pages of carefully integrated language that read like routine legal boilerplate but contained embedded provisions designed to surface later, among them an indemnity clause specifying market rate compensation for professional nursing care in the event unsafe housing conditions were documented. "This looks fine," Nadine said. Same basic terms. She signed on page 8 without once looking at pages 3 through 7. She was moving quickly, certain her standard terms were in place, certain I was too medically diminished and legally unsophisticated to have buried anything that mattered. That certainty was the only opening I required. People who are overconfident don't read past the first page when they're convinced they've already won. I witnessed her signature with the date and time, December 15th, 2022, 10:42 a.m. Nadine Kellner had executed a contract she hadn't bothered to read carefully. In 40 years of construction, I had never put my name on anything I hadn't gone through at least 3 times. I'd learned that lesson watching contractors try to hide liability clauses and change orders in plain sight. She should have learned it too. I slept in a storage room in a house I had built with my own hands. The walls were mine. The floor was mine. The window latch still needed that same half-turn to the left. Some things don't transfer with a deed, even a legitimate one. That first night on the cot, I lay there thinking about foundations and load-bearing walls, about whether a structure can register its builder's presence long after the ownership papers say someone else holds the title. At 7 Huzero Friday evening, I carried a bowl of soup up to Colton's second-floor bedroom. Not because anyone had asked me to, because that's what I'd always done when he was sick as a boy and certain reflexes outlast everything you throw at them. Colton lay in bed with his leg elevated in the cast, the television off a single lamp throwing low light across the room. I had built that room with particular care when he turned 10. Extra blocking in the walls, a window seat with built-in storage, dedicated electrical circuits. I brought the wooden chair I'd built by hand the year Colton was 10 and ran a severe fever. The chair I'd occupied for 3 straight days without sleeping, watching his temperature, offering water every hour, waiting for the fever to break. I set the soup on the nightstand and sat down. Colton looked at me, then away, then at the soup, then at the chair. His eyes went still. "I remember this chair," he said quietly. "I know. You stayed with me 3 days when I had that fever. You never slept." "No," I said. "I didn't." The silence that followed had weight to it, the kind you feel in your chest pressing. Colton studied his hands, then the cast on his leg, then the chair again. "Dad," he stopped, cleared his throat and tried once more. The words stalled somewhere between what he meant and what he could manage to say. I watched him struggle with them, his mouth working, his eyes filling with something I couldn't read clearly in the low light. I gave him room. Let the silence work the way silence does when the thing you need to say is too large to move. But the words never arrived. After a full minute, I stood up. "Eat it before it goes cold," I said. I walked to the door, pulled it nearly shut behind me, and paused in the hallway with my palm flat against the drywall I had finished smooth 20 years earlier. The texture was still perfect. No cracks, no settling damage. Solid work. Colton had almost said something. For 30 years, I'd been waiting for him to complete sentences that started with "Dad," sentences that were supposed to end with explanations, apologies, confessions, promises. Most never made it past that hyphen. That night, standing in the hallway of a house I had built and lost and was now inhabiting as a guest, I thought I could detect something shifting in the silence between us. Not the house settling. The house was solid, engineered to stand 100 years. Something else. The sound a structure makes when it's deciding whether to hold. I'd spent 40 years training myself to hear that sound, the subtle stress signatures, the places where load paths shift the moment just before a beam resolves, whether it can carry what's on top of it or whether it must give way. Colton and I were both positioned on opposite sides of that moment. Some structures, even ones with serious damage running through them, warrant careful assessment before you determine whether to tear them down or try to restore them. I'd understood that about buildings for a long time. I was working on remembering it about people. I went back down to the storage room, closed the door, and stretched out on the cot in the dark. The window latch above me still needed that half-turn to the left. I could have corrected it in 30 seconds. I left it. Some quirks are worth more untouched. They're a record of who put the thing together in the first place. I've been awake at 5:30 my entire adult life. 35 years on construction sites hardwired it into me like a load table, automatic, non-negotiable. On the 3rd morning in that house, it kept me from missing something I needed to see. Colton's near apology the night before had left me sitting with the question of demolish or repair. I'd gone to sleep with structures and stress points on my mind, wondering whether a damaged framework could still be salvaged. I woke Wednesday at 5:30 with those same questions still open. I got up from the cot, dressed, and headed toward the kitchen for coffee. The ground floor hall was still dark, the house quiet except for the furnace cycling below. Then I heard Amber's voice, low and deliberate. I stopped in the shadow where the corridor opened onto the kitchen. There was a gap above the pony wall, structural non-load bearing exactly 42 inches high, that gave me a clean sightline to the granite counter. Amber stood with her back to me, phone against her ear, holding what appeared to be a medical printout. Yes, she said quietly. 8 weeks. A pause. No, he doesn't know yet. Another pause, longer this one. I know the timing is complicated. I'm working on it. She ended the call and set the printout face down on the counter, held that position for a moment with both palms flat on the granite. Then she went back upstairs. I retreated to the utility room without a sound. I knew every floorboard that was inclined to shift. I'd laid that subfloor myself in 2002 and had the joist layout committed to memory. Certain knowledge doesn't go anywhere. I sat on the edge of the cot for a full hour. 8 weeks pregnant. Colton didn't know. In my bag sat documents Garland had assembled, forged signatures, fraudulent deeds, federal structuring violations. A legal framework capable of erasing Amber and Colton financially and potentially criminally. On the counter upstairs sat evidence of a child who would be born into whatever wreckage I set in motion. An unborn child reshapes the geometry of every decision made in its orbit, whether anyone names that or not. I sat in a storage room in my own house and thought about what kind of structure I was raising and what it was meant to shelter and who would be living inside it once I was finished. Some things, once you know them, can't simply be designed around. They have to be designed for. I'd spent 40 years building things intended to outlive their builder. This was different. This required constructing something that would protect people who hadn't drawn a breath yet. On Friday afternoon at 1:00, Nadine and Amber left together for what Amber called an appointment. I watched from the utility room window as the car backed out of the driveway, gave it 3 minutes, then retrieved my high-lumen flashlight and field notebook from the duffel. Colton was upstairs in his room, most likely under from the pain medication. I went to the basement. The cover story was ready if I needed it, auditing the HVAC system for winter efficiency. I'd designed this house with redundant mechanical systems, and I understood every duct run, every valve, every sensor more thoroughly than any contractor Nadine had brought in to renovate. The basement had changed. They'd converted half of it into a home gym, new drywall, rubber flooring, wall-mounted mirrors, commercial-grade equipment. The approved renovation permit was still posted at the base of the stairs. I moved toward the eastern wall where the new drywall met the original foundation. I'd suspected something there from the first night I spent in the storage room directly above it. The floor joist was transmitting a resonance that pointed to subsurface water pooling against the eastern footing. Not catastrophic yet, but wrong. Behind the new drywall Nadine's contractors had erected for the permitted basement gym, I found exactly what I'd been looking for. They had completely filled and sealed an auxiliary hydrostatic relief drainage line. Concrete patch, professional finish, invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there. That line didn't appear on the generic commercial floor plan the renovation crew had worked from. It was on my original master blueprint, a hand-drafted specification I'd added during construction after I discovered the water table ran 8 inches higher than the initial soil report had shown. Blocking it violated International Residential Code Section R405. It also guaranteed that subsurface water pressure would eventually compromise the eastern foundation footing. The early indicators were already present. Efflorescence on the concrete block, hairline moisture tracking, the kind of deterioration that takes 5 to 10 years to become catastrophic but begins accumulating immediately. They had saved themselves maybe $2,000 by bringing in cheap contractors who worked off commercial templates rather than consulting the actual architectural drawings. In construction, that's where everything consequential lives. Not in paint colors or countertop materials or expensive gym equipment. In the drainage system 3 feet below grade that nobody sees until it fails, and when it fails, it brings the whole structure down with it. I documented all of it, 27 high-resolution photographs from multiple angles, precise coordinates measured from the southeastern corner, cross-references to IRC sections R405.1 and R405.2. Notes on current moisture accumulation and projected failure timeline. I put together a 4-page technical report with the kind of exactness I'd once applied to structural failure litigation. Then I went upstairs, opened my laptop in the utility room, and sent the complete file to Garland. The message was one line: building code violations, serious, documented, and entirely their own doing. I hit send and closed the lid. They had renovated everything visible and left untouched everything that wasn't. New flooring upstairs, new countertops in the kitchen, a gym where my utility room used to be. They'd made the house read as though it belonged to them. What they hadn't done, what nobody who hadn't built this house from the ground up would have known to do, was check what was happening 3 feet below the surface. The sealed drainage line wasn't my sabotage. It was their ignorance, their contractors, their decision to pull from generic commercial plans rather than locate the actual architectural documentation. I simply recorded precisely how that ignorance was going to cost them. The remaining question was what I intended to do with the documentation and whether an 8-week pregnancy altered the answer. Garland had parked 2 blocks away, and I walked there at 2:00 in the afternoon as we'd arranged. 2 men talking in a car draws less notice than 2 men talking in a house where at least one of them has been asked to report back. I'd sent him the building code file on Friday. He'd spent the weekend going through everything we had assembled. Now it was Monday, the 2nd week of my stay in the storage room, and Garland said we needed to talk about outcomes. I settled into the passenger seat of a sedan on a quiet residential block. The car smelled of coffee and old paper. Garland had a comprehensive file spread across the center console, tabbed sections, color-coded categories, the methodical architecture of someone who'd spent 40 years constructing legal cases the same way I'd spent 40 years constructing buildings. The POA executed while you were anesthetized is void under the Pennsylvania Uniform Power of Attorney Act, Title 20, Section 501, due to lack of capacity, Garland said without prelude. The principal is required to hold legal capacity at the moment of signing. You didn't. You were under general anesthesia with no cognitive function whatsoever. He turned to the next tabbed section. Consequently, the deed Colton executed under that POA is void ab initio. Void from inception. It was never legally operative. The property transfer never took effect. You remain the lawful owner of record once we move to void the fraudulent instruments. What about criminal exposure? I asked. Substantial. Garland produced another document. The bank withdrawals constitute wire fraud and theft by deception under Pennsylvania statute Title 18 Section 3922 and federal structuring under Title 31 Section 5324, because the aggregate financial damage exceeds $100,000. When you factor in this house value, it triggers statutory prosecution for elder financial exploitation under the Pennsylvania Elder Abuse Statute. What's the sentencing exposure? First-degree felony up to 20 years. I let that number settle. 20 years. Colton was 28. 20 years would carry him to 48. Civil remedies allow for punitive damages. Garland continued. In Pennsylvania, elder fraud cases involving deliberate conduct courts have awarded 2 to 3 times actual damages as a punitive measure. I understand, I said. Garland closed the file and turned to face me squarely. We have everything we need, he said. The question isn't whether we can move, it's what outcome you want. The question sat between us in the car. I had been asked that question once before by a different professional in a different room. My oncologist on the morning she delivered my stage 2 diagnosis. Both times my answer was identical. I want to walk out of this on my own 2 feet, I said. Everything else is a variable we can work with. Garland nodded slowly. That's what I thought you'd say, but I need to understand all the variables first, I said, including the ones you haven't told me yet. Garland looked at me. Why didn't you tell me about the Kellner family connection earlier, I asked. He drew a breath and let it out. 20 years ago during Nadine's divorce, I represented her ex-husband, Garland said. During discovery, I turned up evidence that Nadine had established an offshore trust to systematically shelter marital assets. She'd been moving funds for 18 months before she filed. Classic dissipation of the marital estate. And you've known about this the whole time. I have. Garland's hands rested on the steering wheel. Attorney-client privilege typically survives the conclusion of representation. What I learned in that case remains privileged indefinitely. But you're telling me now because there's a crime-fraud exception. Garland said if a client used the attorney's services to advance a crime or fraud, the privilege doesn't hold. And if Nadine attempts to shelter assets in that offshore trust during current settlement proceedings, which would constitute fraud, I can deploy everything I learned 20 years ago. I looked at him. So you can use it if she tries to conceal assets in this proceeding. Yes, the trust still exists. It exists, Garland said. I checked. Same registration, same trustee, same offshore jurisdiction. She's kept it active all these years. 30 years of friendship, and Garland Hecht had never once mentioned the Kellner family. I sat with that for a moment. He sat with it too, not filling the space, which is something only people who've known each other for a long time can manage without it turning into something. Why are you telling me now? I finally asked. Garland looked out at the gray December afternoon through the windshield. Because now you need it, he said. The plainness of that answer carried more weight than any elaborate explanation would have. Garland Hecht had uncovered something 20 years ago, recognized its potential, and carried it through 2 decades of friendship without a word. Not because he'd lost track of it, not because it lacked relevance, but because the moment hadn't come yet. You waited 20 years, I said. I did. You could have pressed harder during her divorce, built a stronger case for your client. I could have, Garland agreed. But I made a decision at the time that I still don't sit entirely comfortably with. I concluded that certain ammunition is worth holding in reserve. That some engagements are worth conceding if it positions you for a conflict that carries more weight. He turned to look at me directly. I didn't know you then, Garland said. I didn't know Colton. I didn't know this was coming. But I knew Nadine Kellner was the kind of person who builds hidden structures and builds them for a reason. And I knew that at some point someone was going to need to know where those structures were. So you waited. I waited, Garland said, 20 years until you needed it. I thought about Colton upstairs in that house lying in bed with a broken leg. About Amber 8 weeks, along with information she hadn't shared. About Nadine's offshore trust kept current and ready to receive whatever needed to disappear. About my house legally mine but occupied by people who were confident they'd successfully taken it. About the space between destruction and justice. The building code violation. I said, how long before the city moves on a complaint? 10 to 15 business days for an initial site inspection, Garland said. Then 30 days for a remediation notice. Then enforcement begins if they don't comply. So we have time, Garland agreed. The question is how we use it. Garland settled back in the driver's seat and looked out at the gray December street. 30 years. Some people earn trust gradually by never once breaking it. Others earn it by knowing precisely when to deploy what they've been holding. The question was what to do with it. I filed the building complaint on a Monday morning from my car parked 3 blocks from the house using a laptop I'd picked up secondhand for cash 2 weeks before. Not because I was hiding anything, but because certain actions are cleaner without an audience. Garland had handed me the decision point. What outcome did I want? I wanted to walk out of this on my own 2 feet. That meant I needed leverage, not just a legal case. The building code violation was leverage. The formal non-compliance report went to the Cleveland Bureau of Building Inspection at exactly 9:00 a.m. 27 high-resolution photographs detailed engineering annotations, cross-references to the original 2002 permitted foundation drawings held in the Cuyahoga County Archive. The filing went out under the letterhead of an independent engineering consultancy Garland had legally incorporated 2 weeks earlier. The explicit charge unauthorized sealing of a hydrostatic foundation relief system in direct violation of International Residential Code Section R405 and Cleveland Municipal Code Chapter 924. Standard municipal protocol required the Bureau to categorize structural complaints within 5 business days and issue a mandatory physical inspection notice to the owner of record within 3 to 4 weeks. I clicked submit at 9:02 a.m. Then I closed the laptop, slid it under the seat, and drove back to the house to make Colton's breakfast. That's the part I need you to understand. I hit send at 9:02 and then went back to cook a meal for my son, who was lying in a bedroom 2 floors above a drainage violation he'd helped bring about by renovating a house he'd helped steal. The Bureau would take 3 to 4 weeks to respond. I had time. I've always worked better with a clear timeline. Some structures fail slowly. You can track their decline across years if you understand the warning signs. Others go all at once, catastrophically, the moment a single critical support gives way. I was building toward the second kind. That end of week, Nadine came into the kitchen at 6:50 Saturday morning. That was unusual. Nadine didn't appear before 8 on weekends. Her showing up at 6:50 told me something was working on her. Her bearing was intact, tailored, casual, perfect posture, but her phrasing had a jagged quality underneath it. I wanted to go over some outstanding family financial restructurings, she said, pouring herself coffee from the pot I'd made 20 minutes earlier. We should sign some supplementary waivers to ensure absolute clarity going forward for the estate. I kept my back to her, slicing bread for toast. I'll need Garland to look at anything before I sign, I said. You know how lawyers are. Silence. Complete frozen silence. I could feel it pressing into my shoulders. I turned around slowly. Nadine's posture had locked coffee mug suspended halfway to her mouth, eyes fixed on me with the kind of concentration that surfaces when someone realizes they've misjudged something fundamental. You're still in contact with Garland Hecht? She asked. Her voice was controlled but carried an edge. I set down the bread knife. He's been my friend for 30 years, Nadine, I said. Some things outlast a deed. The words landed exactly where I meant them to. I watched her process it, watched her register that I wasn't simply the isolated, beaten-down cancer patient she'd been counting on, that I had professional legal support, that I'd had it the entire time, that everything she'd done might have been witnessed and recorded. She placed her coffee mug on the counter with deliberate steadiness. I see, she said. Do you? Garland Hecht represented my ex-husband during my divorce, Nadine said, each word carefully measured. That was a long time ago. I'm surprised he's still practicing. He's retired from active practice, I said, but he still knows the law and he still knows how to read a contract. Another pause. Nadine's eyes moved to the residency agreement posted on the refrigerator, the comprehensive version Garland had drafted, the one she'd signed on page 8 without reading pages 3 through 7. I should get going, she said. You haven't finished your coffee. I'm not that thirsty. She walked out of this kitchen without another word. I stood there with the bread knife in my hand, watching steam lift off the coffee cup she'd left behind. Nadine Kellner had walked away from something she hadn't finished, and I noted that because she had always struck me as a woman who finished what she started. Something had slipped in her confidence. I didn't yet know whether she'd gotten wind of the building complaint or was simply recalculating what Garland's involvement meant for her position. Either way, the timeline was moving. 3 to 4 weeks for the Bureau to act. Maybe shorter if they prioritized structural safety filings, maybe longer if their caseload was heavy, but it was coming. A building inspector would show up with a clipboard and a code manual and no investment whatsoever in whose name appeared on the deed. His interest would be whether the drainage system met the standard. The standard in this case was the one I had set when I built that house in 2002. Nadine Kellner was about to be measured against my specifications, against the engineering precision I'd brought to pouring that foundation, framing those walls, installing that drainage system. She'd brought in cheap contractors to alter it. She'd renovated everything she could see, new floors, new counters, new gym equipment, made the house red as though it belonged to her. What she had not done was verify what was happening 3 feet below grade, and now the city was going to verify it for her. I picked up Nadine's abandoned coffee mug and poured it down the drain. The coffee was still warm. She'd left in a hurry. That was useful. Panic makes people careless, makes them accelerate, miscalculate, expose things they intended to keep concealed. I'd spent 40 years building structures designed to stand 100 years. I knew how to be patient. I knew how to hold steady and wait for the right moment to apply load. The building complaint was load. Garland's name was load. The residency agreement she'd signed without reading was load. The crime fraud exception that would let Garland deploy everything he knew about her offshore trust was load. I was erecting a framework around Nadine Kellner and Colton and Amber, not walls to contain them, but a structure engineered to produce a specific outcome. The outcome where I walked out on my own 2 feet. Everything else was a variable we could work with. 3 weeks and 2 days after I filed the complaint, I was standing at the storage room window when Nadine went out to collect the mail. I watched her pull from the stack an official certified envelope bearing the return address of the Cleveland Department of Permits, Licenses, and Inspections. Nadine had gone quieter since our kitchen exchange about Garland, more measured, fewer demands. Then she opened the envelope. She tore it open right there on the driveway instead of waiting until she was inside. I tracked her through the dirty glass shoulders, locked the instant she began reading. She moved through the letter twice, then folded it and shoved it into her coat pocket. I knew the text by heart. Notification of mandatory structural code inspection within 10 business days based on documented foundation safety hazards under Cleveland Municipal Code, Chapter 924. Nadine had her phone out before she reached the porch jaw, working in a low, rapid conversation that looked anything but calm. I turned back to my table, poured lukewarm ginger tea from my thermos, and opened my book. A building inspector would arrive with a clipboard and a code manual and no interest in whose name was on the deed. He'd want to know whether the drainage system met the standard. The standard was the one I'd established when I built the house in 2002. Nadine Kellner was about to be measured against my specifications. The inspection would find precisely what I had documented: an auxiliary hydrostatic relief line improperly sealed during renovation. The contractors she'd hired had worked from generic commercial templates rather than consulting the actual architectural plans. That shortcut was about to run her $15,000 to $30,000 in mandatory remediation. I sipped my tea and read another chapter. 4 days later, the ground floor bathroom sink developed a slow drip. I repaired it Thursday evening with a basin wrench in 20 minutes. While I was lying flat beneath the vanity with my flashlight, I heard voices coming through the living room wall. The partition between the bathroom and the living room was the thinnest in the house. I'd built it that way in 2002, interior non-load bearing, no reason to over-engineer it. Standard 2x4 studs, half-inch drywall on each face. Structurally adequate, acoustically transparent. A design decision that had aged well. The voices were sharp, muffled, but distinct. Amber and Nadine. I held still, basin wrench suspended in the air. 80,000. Amber's voice thin and furious. Where does that come from? Nadine's response came back as a low, aggressive hiss. Something about a refinance. And 18 months ago. Amber's volume climbed. You took a second mortgage on this house. Silence. What comes next is the moment I realized just how deep this went and how much I stood to lose if I moved too fast or showed my hand too soon. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If the people closest to you were quietly working against you, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you wait, watch, and build your case in silence? A long, toxic silence followed. Nadine started something about the investment not before Amber slammed her purse down hard. Footsteps moved fast up the stairs. I held still under the sink for another full minute, listening. No more voices, just the furnace cycling in the basement below. I pulled out my phone and sent Garland 4 words. Run the title search. Then I went back to tightening the brass compression nut on the supply line. I finished the repair, Put my tools away, washed my hands in the sink I'd just fixed in the bathroom I'd built in the house that apparently carried a second mortgage nobody had bothered to mention. I went to bed at 10 Huzuru and slept better than I had in months. Sometimes information, even damaging information, is more restful than not knowing. A second mortgage Nadine had refinanced 18 months ago, June 2021, 7 months before the fraudulent deed transfer in February 2022, which meant Nadine had borrowed against property she was planning to steal or already believed she owned through some mechanism I hadn't yet worked out. Either way, it changed the arithmetic. The house had been assessed at around $625,000. If there was a primary mortgage of $480,000 which Colton had taken out using the fraudulent deed and now a second mortgage of unknown size, the equity picture looked entirely different. The property might not be an asset at all. It might be a liability. That would explain Nadine's urgency about getting me to sign waivers, why she'd pushed to establish a residency agreement holding me financially responsible for maintenance, why Garland's name had rattled her so visibly. She wasn't trying to protect stolen property. She was trying to prevent a financial collapse. I lay on the cot thinking about load-bearing structures and what happens when you build on unstable ground. About people who make decisions for short-term gain without running the long-term numbers. About Colton 2 floors above me with a broken leg, married to a woman 8 weeks pregnant who'd just found out her mother had mortgaged the house they'd taken. About Nadine, who had engineered a property theft and immediately borrowed against it, raising a house of cards now drawing scrutiny from municipal code enforcement. And about myself occupying a storage room in my own house, repairing sinks and collecting information through thin walls I'd framed 20 years ago. Some structures fail because they're poorly constructed. Others fail because the ground they sit on was never stable to begin with. Garland would have the title search results by morning. Then I'd know exactly how compromised Nadine's foundation really was. I closed my eyes and listened to the house settle. Every creak, every small shift was recognizable to me. I'd built this place, knew its bones, understood its tolerances, and now I knew it had been mortgaged twice over by people who'd taken it while I was under anesthesia. That information complicated as it made everything felt like forward movement. Forward movement meant I was getting closer to walking out on my own 2 feet. Garland would have the numbers by morning. Garland's email came in Monday morning at 6:45 while I was sitting in my truck outside a diner 3 blocks from the house. Engine on for heat. Phone screen sharp against the January dark. The message was 1 line and an attachment. They trapped themselves. Read the whole thing. I opened the PDF. Title search report. Current owner of record Nadine Kellner. Primary mortgage, $480,000 originated February 2022. Current secondary mortgage, $195,000 originated June 2021. Great Lakes Credit Union, 8.5% interest rate. Current status, 60 days delinquent. Notice of default issued December 28, 2022. I read it 3 times. Nadine had taken out a second mortgage 7 months before Colton forged my signature and transferred the deed. She'd borrowed against property she didn't own yet. The numbers were devastating. Primary mortgage, $480,000. Secondary mortgage, $195,000. Combined debt, $675,000. Current market value, approximately $625,000. The property was underwater by $50,000 before you factored in closing costs, or the mandatory code remediation the city was about to demand. Garland's note at the bottom: you can't steal equity that doesn't exist. I sat in my truck watching steam rise off the coffee shop windows, understanding what my son had actually done. He hadn't stolen an asset, he'd stolen a financial time bomb. I started driving. No particular destination, just movement. Past construction sites I'd worked on decades back. A medical complex in University Circle I'd helped frame in 1996. An elementary school in Shaker Heights where I'd poured footings in 2000. Structures still upright, still solid, still doing what they were built to do. Some buildings can't be saved. Sometimes the foundation is too far gone, the cost of repair outrunning replacement. When that happens, you make sure it comes down in a controlled way. Make sure it doesn't take out the surrounding block with it. I stopped at a red light and watched a demolition crew working on an old warehouse 2 blocks over. Controlled implosion. Charges placed with precision at the load-bearing columns. The structure would fall exactly as designed, straight down, contained minimal collateral damage. That's what good demolition looks like. Controlled collapse with defined boundaries. I drove for another hour before accepting I needed to talk to someone who wasn't Garland. Someone who could ask the questions I wasn't putting to myself. I texted Cecile Thursday morning. Coffee, I need a second opinion on something. She replied within 5 minutes. Edgewater Park, 200, dress warm. Edgewater Park in January was punishing. 32 degrees with wind cutting in off the water. The fountain was frozen solid ice where the spray should have been moving. Cecile was already there at the wall overlooking the point where the Allegheny and Monongahela joined to form the Ohio heavy coat knit hat, hands buried in her pockets. "You look like you haven't slept," she said. "I've been thinking about structural limits," I said. "How much load something can carry before it gives." We walked along the river wall. I laid out the situation, the house, the forged documents, the second mortgage, the property that was underwater. Kept Colton's name out of it, just described the architecture of the problem. "There's a child involved," I said. "Not born yet, but coming soon." Cecile stopped walking, turned to face me. "What does that child need?" The question was so plain it caught me off balance. "I don't know," I said. "Yes, you do." I looked out at the frozen fountain. "She needs to not watch her parents tear each other apart," I said. "She needs them functional even if they're not together. She needs them capable of showing up as parents." Cecile nodded slowly. "Then you know what you won't do," she said. "That's the right place to start, the blueprint." That word hit me like something physical. Blueprint, my word, the professional term I'd used to think about structures for my entire working life. Said by accident by someone who had no idea it was my word. The wind off the water was vicious, but I didn't move. Cold clarifies. Cold strips everything away except what's load-bearing. I watched the fountain frozen mid-spray and thought about water that knows when to stop pushing. "Every structure has load limits," I said. "You can calculate them. Weight, capacity, stress, tolerances, failure points. You can predict with precision how much pressure something can absorb before it fails. People too." "People too," I said. "The question is whether you respect those limits or you push until something breaks." Cecile pulled her coat tighter. "Sounds like you already know what you're going to do," she said. "I know what I'm not going to do," I said. "That's a start." We stood at the water's edge for another 10 minutes watching the rivers converge. Then Cecile said she needed to head back and I walked her to her car. "Thank you," I said. "For what?" "For asking the right question." She smiled slightly. "Doctors get good at that. You learn to ask what the patient needs, not what they want." I drove back thinking about structural limits, about load-bearing walls and failure points and controlled demolition, about the gap between what I was capable of doing and what I ought to do. I had evidence that could legally destroy Colton, proof of forgery, fraud, elder exploitation, 20 years of potential prison time, financial ruin. But I also understood that there was an unborn child who would need her father, who would need him functional even if he was broke, who would need him present even if he was damaged. The question wasn't what I could do to Colton. The question was what I should do for her. Every structure has load limits, including my capacity for revenge. Blueprint. The word Cecile had let slip. The framework for planning, for building, for creating something meant to stand. I needed to build something here, not demolish. Build. But first I needed to understand exactly what I was working with. Conrad Wolfert spread the documents across his conference table the way an engineer lays out blueprints. POA, application, notary, affidavit, title search, mortgage statements, and said, "This is first-degree elder financial exploitation under Pennsylvania statute." I'd spent the weekend after my conversation with Cecile arriving at the understanding that I needed to construct something, not tear things down. But building required knowing precisely what I had to work with. That meant putting everything in front of Conrad, the elder law specialist Garland had recommended. Conrad Wolfert's office sat on the upper floors of a downtown Cleveland building, windows angled out over Liberty Avenue. January light filtered through the blinds and pale bars laying stripes across the conference table's polished surface. Garland had his leather portfolio spread open next to me, every exhibit sorted in the order events had actually happened. Conrad moved through the file without hurrying, the forged power of attorney, my signature reproduced on it in a hand that was almost mine but not quite. Then the quitclaim deed, the one that handed my house to Nadine Kellner. Amber's notary seal stamped on papers she'd supposedly witnessed on a day the records showed her nowhere near Cleveland. Bank withdrawals pulled out in a pattern, $47,000 in total. The title search that surfaced the underwater second mortgage nobody told me about. Conrad's fountain pen tracked across his legal pad in tight, even columns. "The POA document by itself is felony forgery," he said. "Bring in the financial instruments and you're at elder exploitation, first degree, title section, 39221, 20-year ceiling." Garland shifted forward in his seat. "Handwriting analysis, notary logs that put Amber in Columbus the same day she allegedly witnessed the POA here, and bank records confirming Russell never signed off on any of those transfers. Once you fold in the house, the retirement account access and the cash total assets moved exceed $940,000. Conrad's pen kept traveling down the page, evidence, statute, penalty, timeline. I knew that reflex. It's what engineers do, impose order on scattered information before you start building anything. 15 years of elder abuse work, he said, and this one is the clearest I've come across. He told us the DA would move on it the next day. Criminal prosecution, federal exposure, professional sanctions wiping out Amber's notary commission. Everyone connected is looking at total ruin. That phrase sat in the room like a structural load neither of us moved to pick up. 20 years. That was the number on the table. Colton was 28. 20 years forward put him at 48. Amber would be stripped of her license and likely charged separately. Nadine would have the second mortgage scheme pulled into the light. Total ruin. The lever was in my hand. There's something you need to factor in, I said. Conrad raised his eyes from the notepad. Amber is about 3 months along. Baby's due in June. Garland turned his head. That was new to him. I'd held on to it since the night I'd overheard the call. Conrad placed his pen flat on the table. Is this you asking me to pull my punches because of that? No, I said. It's me asking you to hold it as a variable. I'm not going to take that child's family apart unless they leave me no choice. But I'm not going to sit here and let them keep what they stole either. There has to be a structure that fits between those two positions. Help me build it. Conrad rocked back in his chair. You're describing a very tight tolerance, he said. I've worked inside tight tolerances my whole career, I told him. You account for the load, you spec the right materials, and it holds. He considered that, then turned to a clean page. 3 options, he said. Option 1, criminal prosecution. Police report cooperation with the DA, let the process run its course. You get maximum consequences and minimum influence over what happens next. Prison time, your house comes back, eventually the family disintegrates. A line drawn. Option 2, civil suit under the elder exploitation statute. Actual damages plus punitive. Pennsylvania courts have come in at 2 to 3 times actual damages in cases where the wrongdoing was deliberate. Against the total assets transferred, you're potentially looking at $2.8 million. Financially catastrophic for them, but no one goes to a cell. Gives you real leverage in any settlement conversation. Another line. Option 3, private negotiated settlement. You lay the evidence in front of them, demand full restitution, they agree. Least noise, least wreckage, except they don't have the money to make you whole, so it doesn't actually work. He looked across the table. What do you want? I turned Cecile's question over in my mind. What does that child need? A father and a mother. Not rich ones, not flawless ones, just ones who are there, who are functional, who are alive. Settlement is gone, I said. There have to be real consequences. I'm not moving off that, but I don't want criminal as the opening move. Conrad marked the word. First. We go civil, I said. Elder exploitation, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty. Everything that creates maximum financial weight. Criminal stays chambered, in reserve. Garland cut in. And when Colton starts playing games, hiding assets, shredding documents, I met his eyes. Then we fire, I said. But I won't open with a shot when there's a grandchild standing in the line of it. They get one path to handle this without maximum destruction. If they walk away from it, that choice belongs to them. Something I learned over decades of construction. The structures that last aren't the ones built to the theoretical maximum. They're the ones engineered to optimal tolerances, built-in room to absorb stress, flexibility under load. Pure force produces brittleness. Brittleness shatters. This thing I was assembling required that same logic. Civil complaint, criminal held back, Conrad said, his pen moving again. Staged escalation. Full cooperation on asset return and restitution means we stay on the civil track. They conceal or obstruct, we go criminal. That's it. Understand what civil still does to them, Conrad said. That house is already upside down. They cannot satisfy a damages award. Liens, wage garnishment, bankruptcy, that's the road they're on regardless. I know, I said. I can accept that outcome. What I want is for that child to grow up with a father in her life, even a broke one. A mother who's out in the world, even one who lost her license. Let them reckon with what they did. Don't strip away the things that make it possible for them to be parents. Conrad studied me for a measured moment. Most men in your position would have already called the DA, he said. I'm an engineer, I told him. I calculate load limits, mine included. Conrad began laying out the civil complaint. Garland built the exhibit sequence into order. I watched the two of them work and felt the criminal case hovering at my back, inert, stable, like charges placed and wired in a controlled demolition waiting on the signal. I'd landed on containment precision pressure, the largest possible impact within the smallest possible blast radius. But containment requires the other party to respond to it. If Colton pushed past the line, I had what I needed to end it. Wednesday morning, a white Cleveland Municipal Code enforcement van came down the street and turned into the driveway, and Nadine Kellner walked out onto her porch to meet 2 inspectors who stepped out carrying clipboards and cameras and the unhurried manner of officials who don't need to raise their voices. Monday in Conrad's office, I had settled on containment rather than annihilation. Civil, not criminal. Measured. But containment was never the same thing as doing nothing. The code complaint I'd submitted weeks back was now producing results. I stood at the edge of my side yard with a coffee mug and watched it unfold. The male inspector had to be in his 50s, hands that showed decades of site work movements that didn't waste anything. The female inspector was younger, maybe 30, tablet in one hand, laser measuring device in the other. "Good morning, ma'am," the male inspector said. "We're responding to a complaint under Municipal Code Section 92403, unpermitted alterations to drainage infrastructure. We'll require access to the full area of concern." Nadine's expression stayed composed, but the tension was visible underneath it. "This is harassment," she said. "My contractor signed off on everything." The female inspector produced paperwork from her clipboard. "Your contractor was wrong," she said. "The modifications here breach International Residential Code Section R405 along with 3 separate city ordinances. We pulled the original 2002 permitted blueprints this morning. We're here to document what doesn't match them." Nadine's eyes crossed the property line to where I was standing. I lifted my coffee mug an inch, just an acknowledgement. The two of them spent 52 minutes going over the site. I watched from the yard photographs of the drainage trench, laser readings on the slope angles, material checks, setback measurements. When the female inspector drew that red laser line across the trench, I found myself thinking about a string line and a 4-foot level I'd used for the identical calculation 21 years ago. Same problem, same precision required. The instruments had changed. The standard hadn't. The male inspector was cross-referencing his tablet against the archived permit drawings. "The 2002 original was done right," he said to his partner, not bothering to lower his voice. "Clean work. Probably more robust than it needed to be. Whatever they replaced it with." He shook his head. "That's the price of going with the low bid." The female inspector kept writing. "7 violations on my count," she said. "Non-compliant drainage gradient substandard materials, setback distances out of spec, structural changes completed without permits, no inspection documentation, occupancy certificate never updated, and the work wasn't supervised by a licensed contractor." Nadine had descended the porch steps and stood with both arms folded. "What's the number to fix it?" she asked. The male inspector tilted his head. "Depends on who you hire," he said, bringing it to minimum code somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000. "But that's not what the remediation order is going to require." "What will it require?" "Original permitted specifications," he said. "The 2002 blueprints we have on file. That's your standard." The color left Nadine's face. I didn't feel any particular satisfaction about that, not triumph anyway. What I felt was quieter than that: the recognition of a system running as intended, load distributed correctly, the engineered outcome arriving on schedule. The female inspector drew a document from her case, official city letterhead seal at the top. "Administrative remediation order," she said, extending it toward Nadine. 30 days from today for full completion. Licensed contractors only. Every permit pulled, every inspection passed. Work must conform to the original 2002 permitted blueprints as cited in this document." Nadine's hands were unsteady when she took it. "Non-compliance after 30 days carries a penalty of $1,000 per day for each violation," the inspector continued. 7 violations puts that at $7,000 per day beginning on day 31. You'll also be required to retain a licensed engineer to certify the work when it's done. This, Nadine's voice didn't quite hold together. She looked at me across the fence line. "You arranged this. You set this in motion." I put my coffee mug down on the porch railing. "I reported a safety concern to the city, Nadine," I said, and kept my voice even. "The regulations did the rest. That's how code enforcement works when it's properly applied." The male inspector was breaking down his equipment. "You'll need to line up a licensed contractor," he told Nadine. "Permits go through the city website. Inspections get scheduled at each phase. The original blueprints are on file at the county building department. Your contractor will need to pull copies." Nadine stood there holding the order, reading through it a second time. "These are his specifications," she said almost to herself. "You're making me rebuild his system." "We're requiring you to rebuild to the permitted standard," the female inspector replied, "which happens to be the 2002 installation that was removed without authorization." The inspectors loaded their gear and climbed back into the van. Engine turned over, gravel shifted under the tires, and they were gone. Nadine remained standing on the asphalt, the order in both hands. Then she looked across at me. "This doesn't change anything," she said. "It changes the price of what you did," I told her. "You brought in cut-rate contractors to undo work I built correctly the first time. Now you're on the hook to restore it to my standard. That's not revenge, Nadine. That's consequence." She turned and went inside without another word. I picked up my coffee mug and headed in. The code violation was gratifying, but I knew its weight, a tactical result, not the decisive one. Expensive for Nadine, $8,000 to $12,000, probably $15,000 once you factored in engineering, certification, and permit fees. Humiliating too, being compelled to reconstruct the exact work she'd had torn out. But this wasn't the main front. That evening my phone lit up with a text from Colton. "We need to talk tomorrow, just you and me." I held the phone and read it twice. This was the confrontation I'd known was coming. No attorneys, no municipal officials, no paperwork standing between us. Just a father and a son with the full weight of what had happened sitting in the room. I typed back "my house noon." His reply came back immediately. "Okay." I set the phone down. There was no version of this that could be resolved entirely through civil filings and code complaints. At some point it had to be met directly. Tomorrow at noon Colton would walk into the house he'd taken while I was sedated, the house where I now slept in a storage room as an unpaid caregiver, and we'd finally have the conversation that should have happened months ago. I had the evidence. I had the legal structure Conrad had built. The civil complaint was staged and ready to file, the criminal case held back in reserve. What I couldn't account for was what I'd actually say when my son was standing in front of me. Cecile had asked the right question. What does that child need? She needs parents. But what did I need from this? What did justice look like when the person who wronged you shared your blood? I'd find out at noon. Noon came and passed. The chair across the table stayed empty. The coffee I'd set out for Colton went cold in the cup. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd taught him fractions with a measuring tape, where we'd sketched his first treehouse on graph paper and watched the driveway through the window. By 12:15 I'd stopped expecting him. My phone buzzed at 12:23. Not Colton. Conrad Wolfert. "Nadine's attorney just confirmed for 2 p.m. We're ready. You coming?" I looked at the empty chair one more time and typed back "on my way." The engineering principle is straightforward. When a support member fails inspection, you don't abandon the structure. You reinforce what's still sound and keep building. Conrad's conference room carried a different weight this time, less a command post, more something that felt like a formal proceeding. Garland was already there, working through files with the same careful order he'd once applied to sorting supply deliveries on job sites. Conrad stood at the window going over his notes. I took the chair facing the door, the way I'd positioned myself on every job site I'd ever run. You want to see what's coming before it arrives. At 1:58 p.m., Nadine Kellner walked in. She had on a navy designer suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. Her bearing projected the certainty of someone who'd spent decades convincing rooms she'd earned her place in them when she hadn't. A man followed her, late 50s, silver hair, Brooks Brothers suit, leather briefcase with brass clasps. "Clifford Odom," he said, extending his hand toward Conrad. "I represent Mrs. Kellner." His voice had the measured neutrality of an attorney who knew exactly how exposed his client was. Garland's research had him practicing elder law in Cleveland for 30 years. Solid reputation, not the kind of attorney who manufactures evidence or operates without a floor. Which told me Nadine had finally understood she needed someone who could manage her exit, not engineer a win. We settled into our seats. Nadine's eyes touched mine for half a second before she looked elsewhere. Not shame, calculation. She was reading the room, running the same risk assessment she'd probably been running since Garland had relayed Conrad's terms. "Let's begin," Conrad said and slid a folder across the table. "February 14th, 2022, Mrs. Kellner. You signed what you represented as a residency agreement with Colton Pruitt, granting you permission to occupy 527 Briarwood Lane." He opened the folder to the document I'd first encountered in November. "Our handwriting analyst, certified by 3 federal courts, confirms your signature on that document. Also confirms you added Colton's signature after the fact. Different pen, different pressure, slightly different ink batch." Clifford reviewed the analysis report without any shift in expression. Methodical, professional. When he finished, he set it down without a word. "Your bona fide purchaser defense," Conrad continued, "required you to demonstrate you had no actual or constructive notice that the deed was executed under a forged power of attorney. You claimed you received the property in good faith." He advanced another document across the table. "This is your credit card statement from February 2022. 14 charges in Florida while you were on vacation, restaurants, hotels, a cruise. You weren't in Ohio that month, Mrs. Kellner. You were traveling while your son-in-law was forging your granddaughter's grandfather's signature somewhere else entirely." Nadine's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. Garland opened his folder, then unhurried, deliberate, the way you'd turn to the final page of an inspection report when everyone seated already knows the building failed. "March 2003, he said quietly. "Your sister Lorene established a trust and named you as trustee. The trust holds 2214 Linwood Avenue, a Cleveland rental property." He pushed the trust documents across the table. "Lorene died in 2018. Under Ohio trust law, you were required to file accountings with the beneficiaries, Lorene's 2 children. Our investigation found no accounting has been filed since 2018. You've been collecting roughly $1,850 per month in rent, and the beneficiaries have no knowledge the property exists." The color drained out of Nadine's face. not surprise recognition. She'd always understood this door might open one day. Clifford worked through the trust documents, then leaned close and spoke to her in a low voice. The exchange ran about 90 seconds. When he sat back, Nadine's shoulders had dropped a fraction of an inch. "My client is prepared to discuss settlement terms," Clifford said, selecting each word deliberately. Conrad nodded. "Immediate withdrawal of all property claims against 527 Briarwood Lane. Payment of $188,000 covering 22 months of unpaid rent at $200 per month plus attorney fees, inspection costs, and emotional distress damages. Payment plan is acceptable, $50,000 within 30 days, the balance paid over 18 months at 4% interest. In exchange, Mr. Pruitt agrees not to refer the trust matter to the district attorney or to Lorene's beneficiaries." The room went quiet for 15 seconds. I heard the wall clock, the low hum of traffic below, my own pulse. Nadine looked at me, then really looked the way she used to look at Alan when he'd caught her in one of her social fictions at a neighborhood gathering, not asking for mercy, just acknowledging the arithmetic. "Where do I sign?" she said. Conrad pushed the settlement agreement in front of her. Nadine lifted the pen, the same practiced grip she'd used to put Colton's name on documents 10 months earlier, and signed her own name at 2:47 p.m. Legitimate this time. Binding. Clifford countersigned as witness. 4 months of construction executed in 30 seconds. On the way out, Nadine paused at the door. "You were always the better builder, Russell," she said. Not an apology. A professional's acknowledgement of craftsmanship that had outlasted her own. Then she was gone. My phone buzzed as I reached the truck. "Colton, can we meet somewhere neutral? Just talk, please." I stood there looking at the screen, thinking about the empty chair. Noon. The coffee gone cold. 23 years of teaching him how structures carry load. I typed back Shoreway Diner. Tuesday 10:00 a.m. Then I drove home, turning over the question of what foundation, if any, remained worth building on. Colton never answered about the diner. Tuesday passed without a word. By Friday evening, I'd stopped picking up the phone every 20 minutes. Stopped running through what I might say if he actually showed up. Some structures give way before you get the chance to brace them. The call came Saturday morning at 7:58, cutting through the silence of the kitchen while I was measuring coffee grounds. I knew before I picked up the way you sense a foundation is compromised before the cracks appear. Something had given. "Dad!" His voice had the hollowed-out sound of load-bearing walls beginning to fail. I set the scoop down. "What happened?" "She filed for divorce." The words came out flat, rehearsed. Friday evening, she'd left the papers on the counter next to the coffee maker, her ring sitting on top of them. She was at her mother's place. Through the window, I could see the backyard apple tree, the one I'd braced and tied down 15 years ago to correct its lean. The nylon twine had let go sometime in the night. The limb had swung back upright on its own, released. "What does the filing say?" I asked. "Dissolution petition, Cuyahoga County Court." His voice was shaking as he read. "She's requesting equitable distribution of all marital assets and debts. That includes the house, Dad, the $195,000 mortgage default. She's running it all through the court." I filled the coffee maker out of habit muscle memory, carrying me through while my mind turned the numbers over. Equitable distribution in Pennsylvania meant the debt got split based on fault and capacity to pay. If Amber could convince the court she was the deceived spouse ignorant of Colton's forgery, untouched by the fraud, the bulk of it would land on him. "She's positioning herself," I said almost to myself. "What? As the victim, not your accomplice, your victim." The machine gurgled and started its cycle. "She's a notary, Colton. Her license obligates her to verify identity before witnessing signatures. If she goes down beside you, she loses her livelihood. This way, she tells it as you deceived her, forged my signature without her knowledge, pulled her into fraud she never understood." But she understood. She had to have known. "Prove it." The words came out with more edge than I'd planned. "In open court with evidence while she's sitting at that table 8 months pregnant, telling the judge how her husband betrayed her and wrecked her career. Who does the courtroom believe?" 10 seconds of silence. I could hear his breathing unsteady, coming in short pulls. "Dad, I don't know what to do." I looked out at the apple tree, at the limb that had finally found its own vertical after years of being held somewhere else. Not damaged, just released. "I know you don't, son," I said. "That's been part of the problem." He didn't answer. A moment later, the line dropped, not a hang-up, more like a phone laid down when the hands that were holding it couldn't manage anymore. I spent the afternoon in the workshop. Wasn't building toward anything in particular, just keeping my hands moving while my mind worked through the pattern. Once you know how to read a blueprint, the design becomes obvious. Amber had been engineering this exit for weeks, maybe longer. The divorce filing wasn't grief or anger. It was a deliberate extraction move. She was ring-fencing her notary license, her professional standing, her financial footing. Colton was being cut off legally and in every other way. The pregnancy I'd been factoring into every decision, the reason I'd chosen civil lawsuit over criminal charges was now a tool in Amber's hands. She'd turned that child into evidence of her victimhood, proof that Colton had deceived her just as he'd deceived me. The same grandchild I'd tried to protect from having a felon for a father would end up as an exhibit against that father in family court. I ran my palm along a piece of black walnut I'd been saving for a keepsake box, feeling the grain beneath my fingers. Some structures find their true line when the artificial force that's been working against them is finally taken away. The apple tree hadn't been broken by years of restraint. It had just been held off angle. Let go, it returned to vertical on its own. The question was whether Colton could do the same. The phone rang at 9:47 that night. I was in the utility room about to brush my teeth, still in the work clothes I'd never gotten around to changing. I watched the screen through 3 rings before I picked up. Didn't say anything, just waited. I could hear his breathing, first rough and uneven, the sound a person makes when they've been crying or are right on the edge of it. Then 2 words. Dad, I'm sorry. Nothing after them. No account of Nadine pressuring him, no explanation of Amber steering him, no recitation of money problems and how he'd been cornered. No version of the story where he'd meant to make it right before I found out. Just those 2 words sitting in the cold quiet of the utility room. I stood there on the tile in my bare feet, phone against my ear, and felt the full weight of what he was reaching toward. The simple response would have been, "It's okay," or "I forgive you," or "We'll get through this together." The kind of easy absolution that eases the pressure for half a minute before the foundation opens up again underneath you. But it wasn't okay. And forgiveness isn't something you hand over in words. It has to be earned through reconstruction, course by course, joint by joint, every measurement checked, every connection inspected before you move to the next layer. I know, I said. Not forgiveness, not absolution, just acknowledgement, presence. We held the line for 3 minutes. I could hear him breathing, hear the small adjustments of his position, hear what might have been traffic moving past his window. The silence wasn't comfortable. It wasn't reconciliation, and it wasn't resolution. But it was honest. It was the kind of space where something real might eventually be built, if Colton could summon the will to do the actual work. He dropped the call without a goodbye, no parting word, no thanks for staying on the line, nothing. Just silence, then the disconnect tone. I stood in the dark utility room with the phone in my hand, looking at a blank screen. The next morning I was due at Conrad Wolfert's office to finalize the civil complaint. The paperwork named both Colton and Amber as defendants. Fraud, elder exploitation, unjust enrichment. But Amber had already moved, repositioned herself, separated herself from Colton entirely. My son had just apologized. 2 words, no deflection, what sounded like real remorse. But I couldn't stop asking the question, was that remorse his own, or was it the opening position in Amber's legal defense? I didn't get an answer for 3 days. Then Colton texted me a screenshot of his bankruptcy attorney consultation confirmation. No explanation, no request to cover the filing fee. Just the appointment details and 1 line, "Doing it myself like you said." That settled the question about Saturday night. Conrad Wolfert asked me to come alone on Tuesday. The moment I walked into the conference room and saw a bankruptcy petition draft on the table, Form 101, Chapter 7, Debtor Colton, Michael Pruitt. I understood what he was offering, and I already knew I was going to turn it down. Colton's insolvency is uncomplicated, Conrad said, sliding the petition across. $34,000 in medical debt from emergency room and urgent care visits over the past 2 years. His share of the joint mortgage default from the divorce. The retainer he just paid his divorce attorney. It's clean, Chapter 7, no business entanglements, no fraud allegations that would prevent discharge. I scanned through it. Conrad's paralegal had already populated most of the field's monthly income, household expenses, asset schedule, creditor matrix. Thorough professional work. Colton could put his name on this today and have the whole thing cleared in 6 months. I can fold this into the overall settlement package, Conrad continued. Low cost to you, quick resolution for Colton, clean slate. No. Conrad's pen stopped tapping the notepad. Russell. He files it himself, I said, and pushed the petition back across the table. His signature on every form, his credit counseling session, his 341 meeting where he sits across from a trustee and accounts for this debt under oath. His process. That's a 10-year mark on his credit, Conrad said carefully. Car loans, mortgages, apartment applications, landlords pull bankruptcy records. He's 28, I said. He has the years to rebuild. But if he learns now how foundations actually work, that you cannot build on a base someone else poured for you, that the concrete has to cure under your own load before you understand what it's carrying, then he builds something that holds. Conrad studied me for a long beat, then set the petition aside without another word. When Conrad stepped out to take a call, Garland leaned forward in his chair, the leather giving a small sound. You could make this easier on him. Bankruptcy court is not gentle. Trustees ask pointed questions. Creditors can object. The whole mechanism is designed to be uncomfortable. So is foundation work in January, I said. Frozen ground, stiff concrete, hands too numb to feel the trowel properly. But you do it right or the building fails inspection 20 years later. You're using construction language to justify making your son suffer. I'm using construction principles to teach my son how to start over. I held his gaze. Those aren't the same thing. Teaching someone to work concrete means letting them carry the bags, feel the aggregate in their palms, absorb the burn in their shoulders from mixing and spreading and finishing the slab. Give them less than that and you produce someone who believes foundations arrive already set, who never grasps that every structure needs tending, that every corner cut has a way of compounding. Garland went quiet. Then sorting through the ASR fragment, if Colton couldn't hold up under the weight, if the process wore him down rather than shaping him, that would be information too. I said that some loads genuinely exceed what one person can carry. That asking for help is distinct from expecting someone else to do the work. That rehabilitation means doing it yourself, even when the easier road is standing open in front of you. That's a hard lesson to sit with. Most of the ones worth learning are. Conrad came back with revised settlement figures, then was gone again. The office ran too warm, the heating system kicking on every 12 minutes with the regularity of a mechanical clock. Garland moved papers around, sorting files the way he'd sorted supply manifests 40 years back, chronological, systematic, a place for everything. The first Friday of February, Conrad called me back to his office. The conference table had been cleared down to one document centered on bond paper. The notary stamp was visible from the doorway. Nadine Kellner's quitclaim, recorded with the Cuyahoga County Recorder of Deeds at 9:15 this morning, Conrad said, presenting it with both hands the way you'd hand over something that mattered. Grantor Nadine Kellner, grantee Russell J. Pruitt, free and clear of all encumbrances. I took the deed and felt the weight of it. Bond paper has a particular substance to it, solid, permanent, real, the kind you reach for when you need something to endure. I ran a finger across the notary seal and felt the county clerk's impression pressed into the stock. 6 months ago she was sheltering behind a bona fide purchaser defense, Garland said, claiming she had no notice the deed was fraudulent. Now she's handed back $188,000 and returned this. He paused. How does that feel? I folded the deed in thirds, the classic fold, the one legal documents have traveled in since long before I started building, and slid it into the worn manila project folder I'd carried to construction sites for 35 years. The folder's edges had gone soft with age, the tab label faded to brown, but the brass clasp still seated firmly, like a building that's just cleared final inspection. Everything plumb, I said. Everything square, everything documented. You sign off knowing the structure will hold, that the foundation can carry the load, that someone can pull the permits 50 years from now and see exactly how it went together. Conrad smiled. Most clients in your position would say they feel triumphant. This wasn't about that. I closed the folder and felt it click. It was about structural integrity, getting the property rights properly established, the ownership chain clean and unbroken, the documentation airtight. Nadine was done. The threat was resolved. But the satisfaction wasn't in defeating her. It was in knowing the foundation was solid again. The deed felt right in my hands, the way finished work always does. Not exhilarating, not dramatic, correct. I walked out into February cold with the folder under my arm, breath showing in the afternoon air. My truck was 3 rows back in the parking structure, and I was reaching for my keys when the phone buzzed. Text from Cecile Dunford. Coffee tomorrow. I heard Colton filed for bankruptcy. Want to make sure you're okay. I stopped moving and stared at the screen. Colton's bankruptcy consultation was attorney-client privilege, not yet part of any public record. The filing wouldn't surface in the federal PACER system for weeks. But Cecile knew. She'd been following the whole arc of this, somehow understanding more than I'd credited her with. I stood in that cold parking structure holding a deed that proved property rights could be recovered, and a phone that proved someone had been watching my entire moral path through this. I typed back, Shoreway Diner, 9:00 a.m. 9:00. Cecile explained it over coffee the next morning. She'd known Colton's bankruptcy attorney for 20 years, had seen the consultation request come through, and recognized the last name. Not gossip, just the unavoidable overlap that happens when professional circles in a city run shallow enough that everyone's connected. She asked if I was okay. I told her I wasn't sure yet. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in mid-February, Colton loaded the last box into his 2012 Corolla with 155,000 miles and a cracked windshield that spider-webbed across the passenger side. Everything he owned fit in a hatchback closed laptop, a framed photo of Nora, and the toolbox I'd given him when he turned 18. Failure sometimes wears the face of the first honest thing a person has done in years. Nora stood next to me on the porch, her small hand warm inside mine. Colton's 4-year-old daughter from his first relationship spent weekends with me, now part of the informal arrangement he'd worked out with her mother while the divorce moved toward final. She had on her purple jacket with the hood up against the February cold, watching her father load and arrange boxes with a methodical care that I recognized because he'd learned it from me. Bankruptcy attorney said discharge takes 6 months, Colton called from the driveway. Then I start over from scratch. Clean record, but the credit mark runs 10 years. Garland gave you a solid referral, I said. Yeah. He shut the hatchback, the sound bouncing off the garage wall. He stood there with one hand resting on the car, not quite ready to move. The apple tree, he said. I should have taken the rope off it months ago. I looked at the tree limbs standing vertical, now the bark still showing the groove where the nylon twine had cut in across the years. Yes, I said. Come back in March and help me prune it. He held my eyes then, not asking permission, not looking for absolution, just acknowledgement. I will. When he got in the car, his posture told me something. Spine straight, shoulders back. Not a man who'd been broken. A man who was beginning to rebuild. He pulled out of the driveway, slowly easing over the gravel and rounded the bend and was gone. Nora tugged my hand. Is Daddy coming back for the tree pruning? And other things, I said, when he's ready. She nodded, satisfied with an answer that gave her something real to hold on to. The apple tree I'd staked and tied to correct its lean, then left bound far too long. Colton had been that tree, the rope pressing into bark growth distorted by years of artificial pressure. Letting him leave meant removing the restraint and trusting that the tree still knew which way was up. Some structures return to true once the load is lifted. Others stay bent. You can't know until you release them. The coffee conversation with Cecile had stayed with me. Thursday afternoon at the diner, bitter coffee between us. She'd said she'd been watching how I'd handled the whole thing. Not the legal strategy, the moral part. The decisions about how far to push. I still don't know if I got it right, I'd told her. He's bankrupt, divorced, starting over at 28. He's also alive, employed, and learning, she'd replied. That's a foundation. You can build on that if the concrete's sound. She'd stirred sugar into her coffee, the spoon clicking against the ceramic. Garland mentioned you were thinking about a road trip. Garland talks too much. Garland thinks you've earned it, she'd smiled. 15 years of talking about Route 66 and the Pacific Coast Highway. Maybe it's time to stop sketching the plans and actually break ground. I'd carried that conversation through the week about structural limits, about knowing when to stop bearing other people's load, about the difference between supporting weight and being flattened by it. The last Saturday of February, Garland spread a massive paper roadmap across his kitchen counter, the kind that hasn't been printed regularly in years, all accordion folds and worn creases, the paper gone soft at the edges. A bottle of whiskey sat nearby, 2 glasses already poured. You've been talking about this trip for 15 years, Garland said. No more deadlines, Russell. Colton is handling his own foundation work. Nadine's paid and gone. The house is yours legally and in fact. What are you still waiting for? I traced routes with one finger. Cleveland to Nashville, down to New Orleans, west through Texas. The Smokies, the Badlands, Albuquerque with its high desert light, the Pacific Coast Highway, winding along cliffs I'd only ever seen in photographs. Nashville to New Orleans, I said. Then west through Texas, maybe Albuquerque, end at the Pacific. That's 3 weeks minimum, Garland said. Longer if you actually stop anywhere. I've got time. Garland took a drink and set his glass down with care. I know someone who might want to ride along as navigator. Good with maps, asks the right questions, can sit in silence without filling it. I looked at him. Cecile. I didn't say that, he smiled. But yes. I pulled my mechanical pencil from my shirt pocket, the one I'd used to draft construction plans for 35 years, the grip worn smooth, the clip bent slightly out of true, and drew a steady, deliberate line across the map. Cleveland to Nashville to New Orleans to Texas to Albuquerque to California. The route looked like a load-bearing span crossing the country, connecting foundations I'd never yet walked on. Precise, measured. The same hand that had calculated structural tolerances and verified load capacities now mapping something altogether different with the same exactness. Some journeys want careful planning. Others want the nerve to follow the line once it's drawn. Departure in 3 weeks, I said. Back before summer. No schedule past daylight and curiosity. Garland raised his glass. To earned freedom. Driving home with the map folded on the passenger seat, I called Cecile. 2 rings. I wondered when you'd call, she answered. Have you ever been to New Mexico? No. I've heard the light is different out there, something about the altitude and the angle of it. Would you like to find out? I kept my voice level, the way you keep your hands steady when marking a critical measurement. Departure in 3 weeks. Back before summer. No schedule beyond daylight and curiosity. The silence ran 3 seconds long enough to hear her breathing, to picture her turning variables I couldn't calculate. "What kind of music do you listen to on long drives?" she asked. I smiled at the windshield at the road ahead. "I don't know yet. That's part of finding out." "Then yes," she said. "I'll navigate." She'd said it over the phone the way someone answers when they've been waiting 3 years for the right question. Thursday afternoon at the cancer center, one last coffee before the trip. Cecile studied me from across the table. "Garland mentioned me specifically," she asked. "He said he knew someone who might want to see the country, who asks the right questions and can sit in silence without needing to fill it." She stirred her tea, the spoon tapping against ceramic. "I haven't left Cleveland in 3 years, not since Robert died." "Neither have I," I said. "Something we've both been doing too long." She looked at me then with the same measured attention she'd turned on me when I first walked into group back in November, reading not what I said but what I was carrying underneath it. "I'll need to bring the thermos," she said. "Ginger tea for 3,000 miles. I was counting on that. Friday morning I ran a final walkthrough of the house, an engineer's closeout inspection. The basement was dry and sound, utility room swept out. The kitchen window latch still needed its particular half-turn to the left. I'd meant to fix that for 15 years and decided this morning to leave it alone. White paint on the cabinet edges going thin, the oak underneath coming through. Colton's room stood bare except for clean patches on the walls where posters had lived. The backyard apple tree rose straight and unburdened the groove in the bark where the twine had pressed for so long, already beginning to soften. I locked the front door at 11:23 a.m. and dropped the brass key in my pocket alongside my mechanical pencil. The key felt lighter than it had any right to. Brass weighs what brass weighs. But the weight of defending that house, establishing ownership, fighting to keep it, that was gone. Possession sits heaviest when you're scared of losing it. Saturday came in clear and cold. 6:47 a.m. Garland's pickup rolled into the driveway. He'd insisted on taking his truck. Better shocks, newer tires, a backup camera I'd never gotten around to installing on mine. Cecile was already in the passenger seat, thermos open, steam lifting off the mouth of it in the March dawn. I dropped my duffel in the bed next to Garland's camping gear and Cecile's neatly organized luggage, then folded myself into the back seat. "Final check," Garland said. "Stove off, water main marked, mail hold confirmed." "Everything documented and locked," I said. Cecile unscrewed the thermos cap and ginger tea drifted through the cab, the same scent that had marked every meeting since November. She poured 3 cups into the nested set she'd brought and passed them back. "GPS says 43 hours to Los Angeles," Garland said, shaking open the big paper road map across the dashboard. The sound of old creased paper filled the truck. "I say we take 90 days if we want." "No deadlines," I agreed. My phone buzzed. Colton calling. I looked at the screen, then passed the phone to Cecile. She answered. "Hi, Colton. Your father's driving. He'll call you from Nashville." A pause. "Yes, he's okay. Better than okay." Another pause. "March, probably. He'll let you know about the pruning." She ended the call and handed the phone back. He wanted to say good luck. The traffic light at the end of the street cycled to green. "Last chance to reconsider," I said. Garland put the truck in drive. "Drive, Garland," Cecile said and smiled at her own phrasing. "West, Interstate 480, west." The highway opened ahead of us. The same road I'd taken 10,000 times toward job sites and supplier yards and inspection offices. This time there was no destination on any blueprint. Cecile refilled the cups. Garland found a radio station playing something I didn't recognize but found I didn't mind. I watched Cleveland pull away in the mirror. The steel bridge spans the river, the hills where I'd framed houses for 35 years. The city folded behind a curve and was gone. By 9:00 p.m. we'd crossed into Pennsylvania. Garland's back, demanding the kind of movement that comes from a lifetime of foundation work. We pulled off at a rest stop outside, wheeling the lot nearly empty under sodium lights. "I need to stretch," Garland said. We walked out past the pavement to where the lights thinned and the sky opened. Pennsylvania stars, dense, clear, almost overwhelming, packed the darkness above the highway. More of them than Cleveland's light pollution ever allowed. Same stars, just better visibility. I drew the original 2002 master blueprint from my breast pocket. The paper had gone soft across 21 years of folding and unfolding edges, worn, the blue lines faded to gray and spots. I held it under the sodium glare one last time. Every room labeled, every dimension marked, every structural element recorded. Then I folded it back along its worn creases and walked to the truck. "What's that?" Cecile asked. "Proof of ownership for the house," I said, opening the glove box. "Turns out I don't need the paper to know what's mine." I laid the blueprint flat beneath the owner's manual and insurance documents. Then I took out my mechanical pencil, the one I'd carried for 35 years, grip worn smooth, The clip bent from decades in my shirt pocket turned the lead sleeve once by habit and set it beside the blueprint. 60 years I've carried a mechanical pencil, I said. First time I've gone a full day without using it. How does that feel? Cecile asked. I looked up at the stars, thousands, maybe millions of them, an overflow of light above an infinite reach of road stretching west. Like the blueprint I need now isn't something I can draw. Garland stood with both hands in his pockets, head tipped back. You can't see this in Cleveland. Too much light pollution. Too much everything pollution, Cecile said almost to herself. The longer we looked, the more the sky revealed layers of light that had been there the whole time, only blocked. Freedom wasn't a matter of changing what was there. It was a matter of clearing away what was covering it. I stood between Cecile and Garland under that sky. My house locked and quiet behind me in Cleveland, the blueprint folded in a glove box somewhere underneath me, the road ahead running west. For the first time in 60 years, I had no project to finish, no deadline pressing, no structure to defend. Just 3,000 miles of open road, 2 people who'd chosen to make the trip, and the understanding that the most enduring architecture has nothing to do with concrete and plans. It's built from choices and company, from knowing what to hold and when to let go. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. Genuinely. This story cost more than I expected to carry and more than I expected to tell. Looking back now, what strikes me most isn't the forgery or the settlement money or even the moment Nadine Kellner signed that deed back over to me. What stays with me is how much damage a person can absorb before they realize that absorbing it quietly isn't the same as accepting it. I believe God put the right people in front of me at the right time, Garland, Cecile, Conrad, not to fight my battle, but to remind me I still had the strength to fight it myself. That timing wasn't accidental. If these grandpa revenge stories and father stories teach anything, let it be this. Document everything. Not because you expect betrayal, but because the people who want to take what's yours are counting on you not to. When someone reveals who they are through their actions, believe them the first time. Don't build on a foundation you already know is cracked. Patience is not weakness. The most effective response is almost never the fastest one. And if you're a parent, especially a father, remember that the most powerful thing you can leave your child isn't money or property. It's the example of what it looks like to stand up with dignity when everything is on the line. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment and tell me what part stayed with you. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Grandpa's Revenge. There are more stories where this one came from. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.